The prisoner's dilemma. Have you ever been in a situation where you and another person both wanted the same thing, but by competing for it, you both ended up worse off? Maybe it was a school project where nobody wanted to do extra work, a business rivalry that led to both companies losing money, or a political standoff where neither side backed down, resulting in disaster. This is the prisoner's dilemma, a paradox in game theory that reveals a strange truth about human behavior. Sometimes, the logical choice for the individual leads to the worst outcome for the group. It's a situation where people act selfishly to protect themselves, even when cooperation would have led to a better result for everyone. To understand how it works, imagine this scenario: two criminals, let's call them Alex and Jordan, are arrested for a crime. The police don't have enough evidence to convict them, so they offer both prisoners the same deal. If Alex betrays Jordan by testifying against them, and Jordan stays silent, Alex goes free, while Jordan gets 10 years in prison. If Jordan betrays Alex while Alex stays silent, then Jordan goes free, and Alex gets 10 years in prison. If they both betray each other, they each get 5 years in prison, but if they both stay silent, they only get 1 year in prison each, because the police don't have enough evidence. At first glance, the best outcome for both prisoners would be to stay silent, so they each only get 1 year. But here's where the dilemma appears. Neither one knows what the other will do. Each prisoner has to think about their own survival. If Alex trusts Jordan to stay silent, but Jordan betrays Alex, then Alex ends up in prison for 10 years, a terrible outcome. The safest choice is to betray first, but Jordan is thinking the exact same way. If both of them betray each other, they both get 5 years, which is worse than if they had just cooperated. This is the paradox of the prisoner's dilemma. Each person acts in their own self-interest, but in doing so, they create the worst possible outcome for both of them. Now, this isn't just a theoretical scenario, it plays out everywhere in real life. Two competing companies both want to attract customers. If they both keep their prices high, they both make good profits. But if one company lowers its prices, it will steal customers from the other. The problem? The second company doesn't want to lose customers either, so they lower their prices too. In the end, both companies suffer because they undercut each other so much that neither makes a good profit. Instead of cooperating to maintain fair prices, they both lose. In international relations, countries face a similar dilemma. Imagine two nations building nuclear weapons. If neither builds them, both are safe. But if one country secretly builds weapons while the other does nothing, the second country is at a disadvantage. So both decide to arm themselves, leading to an arms race that makes the world more dangerous. This is exactly what happened during the Cold War, where the US and the Soviet Union spent billions building up nuclear weapons, not because they wanted war, but because each side feared the other would betray them. In the end, both nations drained their resources and lived in constant fear, a worse outcome for both sides than if they had simply agreed to stop. The prisoner's dilemma also appears in environmental issues. Every company and country knows that if everyone pollutes less, the planet benefits. But each company also knows that cutting pollution costs money. If they cut emissions while others don't, they fall behind economically. So everyone keeps polluting, even though cooperation would have been better for the whole planet. It's a classic case where individual survival instincts lead to global harm. Even in personal relationships, the prisoner's dilemma plays out. Imagine two people in a romantic relationship who both want to be more open and vulnerable. If they both share their feelings, they will become closer. But each person is afraid of getting hurt, so they hold back. The result? Neither person opens up, and the relationship weakens, even though if they had just trusted each other, they would have been happier. In modern dating culture, people often avoid commitment out of fear that the other person won't commit first. Instead of developing deeper connections, both sides keep their guard up, leading to loneliness instead of real relationships. The reason this paradox is so common is distrust. People don't want to take the risk of trusting others, because if they do, they might get betrayed. It's a situation where everyone wants to cooperate, but no one wants to be the first to do it. This is why competition often leads to worse outcomes for everyone, and why societies create rules, laws, and agreements to encourage cooperation. The key to avoiding this trap is trust and communication. When people, businesses, or nations talk openly and create agreements where cooperation is rewarded, the paradox can be avoided. Some ways to break the cycle include creating long-term trust. When people know they will have to interact in the future, they are more likely to cooperate instead of betray. This is why trade agreements between countries reduce the likelihood of war, Both sides have too much to lose. Setting rules that encourage fairness is another solution. In business, regulations prevent companies from engaging in destructive price wars. In sports, rules ensure fair play instead of reckless competition. Building social norms that encourage cooperation can also help. In personal relationships, learning to communicate openly reduces fear of betrayal. In friendships, setting expectations for honesty creates trust over time. The prisoner's dilemma teaches us a powerful lesson. Acting selfishly might feel like the safest choice, but in many situations, it creates worse outcomes for everyone. Sometimes, the only way to truly win is to trust that others will do the same. So the next time you find yourself in a situation where it seems safer to act selfishly, ask yourself, what happens if both sides do this? Would trusting the other person actually create a better outcome? Is there a way to communicate and find a solution where everyone benefits? Because in the end, selfishness doesn't always lead to survival. Sometimes, the best way forward is learning how to work together. The Ship of Theseus Paradox. Imagine you are walking along the docks of an ancient city, and before you stands the great ship of Theseus. This legendary vessel, used by the mythical hero himself, has been carefully preserved over the centuries. But time is relentless. The wooden planks decay, the sails tear, the mast weakens. So piece by piece, everything is replaced. Eventually, not a single original part remains. And yet, it is still called the Ship of Theseus. But here's the question. Is it still the same ship? This is the Ship of Theseus Paradox, a question that has perplexed philosophers for thousands of years. It challenges the very concept of identity. What makes something the same thing? Is it the materials it's made from, the function it serves, or perhaps something more elusive, its essence? Now let's take this thought experiment even further. Imagine that, as the original planks of the ship were removed, they weren't discarded. Instead, they were carefully stored away, preserved, and eventually reassembled into another ship, identical to the original. So now we have two ships, one that has been gradually replaced over time, and another that has been rebuilt using every single original part. Which one is the true Ship of Theseus? The one that has remained in continuous use, or the one that retains all its original components? This paradox applies to far more than just ships. Take a moment to consider yourself. Your body is not the same as it was a decade ago. Nearly every cell has been replaced. Your thoughts have evolved. Your memories have shifted. And yet, you still feel like you. So what is it that makes you you? Is it your physical body, your consciousness, a continuous thread of experiences? Philosophers throughout history have proposed different ways of approaching this paradox. One idea is that identity is not tied to material objects, but rather to function and continuity. In this view, the ship that was continuously maintained and sailed remains the true Ship of Theseus, because it has existed without interruption. The materials don't matter. What matters is that it has been in use, recognized, and treated as the same entity over time. Another perspective is known as mereological essentialism, which argues that an object is defined by its specific components. According to this idea, once the original planks are removed, the ship is no longer the Ship of Theseus, it's just a replica. Instead, the reassembled version, made from the original parts, is the real ship. A third approach, proposed by philosopher David Lewis, is called the four-dimensionalist view. This theory suggests that objects exist not just in space, but also across time. In this sense, the Ship of Theseus isn't just one thing at one moment, but rather a series of connected states stretching through time. Under this view, the paradox isn't really a paradox at all. Both ships are part of the same larger entity, existing in different forms across time. And then there's the psychological perspective. Some argue that identity isn't about physical materials or continuity, it's about perception. If everyone agrees that the continuously maintained ship is the true Ship of Theseus, then it is. Identity, in this sense, is just a mental construct, shaped by collective agreement. But the implications of this paradox go far beyond philosophy. This same dilemma appears in medicine, technology, and even law. If a person receives an organ transplant, does it change who they are? If an old building is slowly renovated until nothing original remains, is it still the same building? If a company replaces every employee, restructures itself, and adopts a new name, is it still the same company? And consider artificial intelligence. If we were to transfer a person's consciousness, thought by thought, into a machine, is that still the same person? If the original biological body is then discarded, does the identity remain? The ship of Theseus paradox forces us to confront a fundamental question: what truly defines something's identity? Is it the physical components that make it up? Is it the continuity of its existence? Or is identity something we create in our own minds? Something that exists only because we believe in it? So, as you go about your day, take a moment to think. If everything around you slowly changed, would it still be the same? And if you yourself are always changing, are you still you? The Abilene Paradox. Imagine you are sitting in a room with a group of friends, trying to decide where to go for dinner. You aren't particularly excited about any option, but to keep the peace, you agree to a choice that someone else suggests. One by one, everyone follows suit, each person assuming that the others really want to go there. But here's the twist: none of you actually wanted this option. Yet, because no one spoke up, you all end up in a restaurant that nobody truly enjoys. This is the Abilene Paradox, a strange and unsettling phenomenon where a group of people collectively decide on a course of action that none of them actually want. It happens when individuals, fearing disagreement or conflict, assume that others feel strongly about something, when in reality no one does. The paradox gets its name from a story told by management expert Jerry B. Harvey in 1974. Imagine a family sitting on a porch in Texas on a hot summer day. Someone casually suggests taking a drive to Abilene, a town 50 miles away. One by one, each family member agrees, not wanting to seem difficult. They get in the car, drive through the scorching heat, endure a long and uncomfortable journey, and finally arrive in Abilene, only to realize that none of them actually wanted to go. They all just assumed the others did. This is where the paradox takes shape. How can a group of people make a decision that none of them support? How does something like this even happen? The answer lies in social dynamics, miscommunication, and the fear of rocking the boat. People often conform to what they think others want, even when it goes against their own desires. It's not peer pressure in the traditional sense. No one is forcing anyone to go along. Instead, it's self-imposed pressure based on mistaken assumptions. But the Abilene Paradox doesn't just apply to trivial choices like dinner plans or road trips. It can shape entire businesses, governments, and societies in ways that are far more serious. Think about a workplace where employees dislike a new policy, but assume that management is committed to it, so no one speaks up. Management, meanwhile, assumes that the employees are fine with it because no one complains. In the end, the entire organization moves forward with a decision that benefits no one. Or imagine a political situation where leaders support a policy, not because they believe in it, but because they think the public does. Meanwhile, the public assumes the leaders believe in it, so they don't question it. Both sides are acting based on a false belief that the other side wants this decision. The result, a policy that nobody truly supports, yet continues simply because no one dares to challenge it. And then there's war. Some historians argue that entire wars have been fought because of the Abilene Paradox, nations engaging in conflict, not because they truly want to, but because each side mistakenly believes the other is fully committed to war. Diplomats, generals, and political leaders, all assuming that war is inevitable, fail to explore alternatives, leading to destruction that no one actually wanted. So why do we fall into this paradox? At its core, the Abilene Paradox is driven by fear of rejection, conflict, and embarrassment. People don't want to be the one to challenge the group. They assume that speaking up will create tension, make them seem difficult, or alienate them from others. So they stay silent, and the cycle continues. But here's the terrifying part. This paradox isn't just about groups. It happens in your own mind. Think about the choices you've made in life. How many of them were truly your decisions? How many times have you gone along with something because you assumed it was expected of you? A career path, a relationship, a major life decision. Was it what you really wanted? Or were you just following the road that seemed easiest, the one you thought others wanted for you? And if you never stop to question those choices, are you living your own life, or someone else's mistake? The prediction paradox. Have you ever noticed that the more we try to predict the future, the more uncertain it becomes? That the more we analyze a system, the more chaotic and unpredictable it seems to get? Have you ever made a plan, thinking you had accounted for everything, only to watch reality unfold in a completely unexpected way? This is the prediction paradox, a strange and frustrating truth about human understanding. The more we try to predict the future, the harder it becomes to do so accurately. The very act of making predictions can change the outcome, and even when we think we've accounted for all possibilities, reality finds a way to surprise us. At first, this seems counterintuitive. We live in an age where we have more data than ever, where artificial intelligence can process vast amounts of information in seconds, and where entire industries are built around forecasting trends, economies, and even human behavior. With so much knowledge and technology, you'd think our ability to predict the future would be better than ever. But in many ways, it's not. If anything, it often feels like the more data we have, the less predictable things become. One reason for this is that many systems, whether it's the economy, the weather, or human behavior, are complex and dynamic. Even the smallest change in one part of the system can have massive, unpredictable consequences elsewhere. This is known as the butterfly effect, the idea that a tiny event, like a butterfly flapping its wings, could eventually cause a hurricane on the other side of the world. A classic example of the prediction paradox is economic forecasting. Economists use models, data, and trends to predict things like inflation, stock prices, and recessions. But time and time again, economic predictions fail spectacularly. The 2008 financial crisis is a perfect example. Almost no one saw it coming, even though all the warning signs were there. The best experts in the world, armed with massive amounts of financial data, were blindsided. The same thing happens in politics. Pollsters and analysts spend months predicting election outcomes, yet time and time again, they get it completely wrong. Voters change their minds. Unexpected events shift public opinion, and what seemed like a sure outcome suddenly flips at the last moment. Another classic example is weather forecasting. Meteorologists have access to satellite data, supercomputers, and advanced climate models. Yet even with all this technology, long-term weather forecasts remain unreliable. Why? Because the atmosphere is a chaotic system. Tiny variations in temperature, pressure, and wind patterns can lead to completely different outcomes. The farther ahead we try to predict, the more inaccurate we become. The prediction paradox also appears in sports and competitions. Analysts spend hours breaking down statistics, past performances, and player strategies, yet underdogs still win, top-ranked teams still choke, and completely unexpected outcomes happen all the time. No matter how much we analyze the past, the future remains uncertain. This paradox is also seen in personal life. Think about how often we try to plan our lives. What career we'll have, where we'll live, who we'll marry. But reality rarely unfolds as expected. A person might go to college for one field and end up working in something completely different. Someone might plan to live in one city forever, only to move across the world unexpectedly. We assume we can predict where we'll be in 10 years. But looking back, it's obvious how unpredictable life really is. So why does this happen? Why does predicting the future often make things less clear instead of more clear? One reason is that predictions change behavior. If people believe a stock will go up, they buy more of it, which drives the price higher. But then when too many people invest, the market corrects itself and crashes. If a weather forecast predicts rain, people adjust their plans, which in turn changes the traffic, demand for services, and even how the weather pattern develops. The prediction itself influences reality, making it harder to get right. This is why in some areas, the most accurate predictions are the ones no one believes. If an expert predicts an economic crisis and people take action to prevent it, the crisis never happens, making the prediction seem wrong. If a scientist warns about a pandemic and governments respond effectively, the outbreak is contained, making it look like the warning was unnecessary. Another reason predictions fail is unknown variables. No matter how much data we have, we can never account for everything. Unexpected events, technological breakthroughs, political revolutions, natural disasters completely alter the course of history in ways no one saw coming. Consider World War I. Before it happened, almost no one believed a large-scale war was possible. The world was economically connected, and leaders thought no country would risk such destruction. But then a single assassination, something that seemed minor at the time, set off a chain of events that led to one of the deadliest conflicts in history. The same unpredictability applies to technological revolutions. In the early 2000s, almost no one predicted that social media would reshape politics, culture, and mental health the way it has. Decades ago, people imagined flying cars and space colonies by now, but almost no one predicted that the internet and smartphones would completely redefine human interaction. So how do we deal with the prediction paradox? The key is flexibility and adaptability. Instead of trying to predict the future with certainty, we should focus on preparing for uncertainty. Before making a prediction, ask, am I assuming the future will be like the past? What are the unknown variables that could change everything? If my prediction turns out wrong, am I flexible enough to adapt? Am I considering how my prediction itself could influence reality? The best strategies in life, business, and politics aren't based on rigid predictions, but on resilience and adaptability. The most successful people aren't those who can see the future, but those who can adjust to whatever the future brings. The prediction paradox teaches us that certainty is an illusion. No matter how much data we have, the future remains unknown. And maybe that's not a bad thing. If everything were predictable, life would be boring. The surprises, the unexpected turns, the moments we never saw coming, these are what make life exciting. So the next time you try to predict the future, remember the world is too complex, too chaotic, and too alive to be reduced to a simple forecast. Instead of asking, what will happen? Ask, how can I prepare for anything? Because in the end, the only thing predictable about the future is that it will always surprise us. The observer's paradox. Have you ever noticed how people behave differently when they know they're being watched? Maybe you've caught yourself sitting up straighter when someone enters the room or speaking more carefully when a camera is rolling. Have you ever tried to act natural but ended up feeling awkward instead? The more you try to behave normally, the less natural you actually feel. This is the observer's paradox, a fascinating contradiction where the act of observation changes the very thing being observed. It appears everywhere in social science, physics, psychology, and even our daily lives. The moment someone knows they're being watched, they adjust their behavior, sometimes consciously, sometimes without realizing it. This means that true, unaltered behavior is nearly impossible to observe, because the act of watching itself changes it. At first, this might seem like just an odd quirk of human nature, but the implications of the observer's paradox stretch far and wide. It raises deep questions about authenticity, self-awareness, and even the nature of reality itself. If people act differently when they're observed, then how much of human behavior is authentic? And in a world where cameras, social media, and constant surveillance are everywhere, are we ever truly behaving as ourselves, or are we all just actors, adjusting our actions based on who might be watching? One of the clearest examples of this paradox happens in scientific research, specifically in psychology and sociology. Scientists and researchers have spent decades trying to study human behavior, but they always run into the same problem. Once people know they're being studied, they behave differently. A researcher trying to observe natural conversations in a workplace might find that employees become more formal when they know they're being analyzed. A study on children's behavior in classrooms might fail because the students act more disciplined simply due to the presence of an outsider. The goal of studying natural human behavior often fails because the act of studying itself changes the behavior. A well-documented example is in language studies. Linguists have long tried to capture how people speak in their natural environment, how slang evolves, how accents shift, how speech changes in different social settings. But when someone knows they are being recorded, they unconsciously change their speech patterns. They enunciate more clearly, drop informal phrases, or avoid using filler words like and like. The problem? The researchers are now studying an artificial version of speech, not the real, everyday language people use when they think no one is listening. The same paradox appears in law enforcement and surveillance. Police body cameras, security footage, and even the presence of an officer can change how people behave. Sometimes, cameras make people act more carefully, following the rules more strictly than they normally would. But in other cases, knowing they are being watched makes people act dishonestly or performatively, as if they are putting on a show. Criminal behavior might shift to areas where surveillance doesn't reach, and police officers themselves might act differently when they know their actions are being recorded. The paradox creates a strange loop. Does observation create accountability, or does it just encourage people to act in ways that hide their true behavior? Even in everyday social interactions, the observer's paradox plays a role. Have you ever noticed that when you're speaking casually with a friend, the conversation flows naturally? But the moment you're giving a public speech or being recorded, your voice changes. You become more aware of your own words, more careful, more self-conscious. The act of observation forces you to think about what you're doing, which in turn makes it harder to do naturally. This is also why people behave differently around authority figures. Students act one way when a teacher is watching, and another when the teacher leaves the room. Employees act more professional when the boss is around, but relax when they're with colleagues. The same happens in social settings. People might speak or act differently depending on who is listening, constantly adjusting to the perceived expectations of their audience. The paradox isn't just limited to human behavior, it even extends to quantum physics. In one of the strangest discoveries in modern science, the double-slit experiment showed that tiny particles like electrons behave differently depending on whether or not they are being observed. When no one is watching, electrons act like waves, spreading out as if they are in multiple places at once. But when scientists try to measure them, they collapse into particles, acting as though they are being forced into a single state. The implications of this are profound. It suggests that at the most fundamental level, the act of observation itself changes reality. The paradox also appears in self-awareness and mental health. Have you ever noticed that the moment you start thinking about your own breathing, it suddenly feels unnatural, or that the second you focus on your posture, it becomes uncomfortable? This happens because our minds are designed to let many actions happen automatically, but when we focus on them, they feel forced. The same thing happens with emotions. If someone asks, "Are you happy?" you might suddenly start questioning whether you really are, even if you felt fine just moments before. This paradox has deep philosophical implications. If people change their behavior based on whether or not they are being watched, then what is their true self? Are we ever truly ourselves, or are we always performing? And in a world where social media captures every aspect of our lives, are we becoming more artificial, constantly curating an image of ourselves, rather than simply existing? Think about how often people perform for social media. People act differently in front of a camera than they do in private. Some influencers curate entire personas, behaving in ways that attract engagement rather than expressing their real emotions. When you scroll through social media, are you seeing people's real lives, or just a performance of what they want you to see? So how do we escape the observer's paradox? The truth is, we can't completely escape it, but we can become aware of it. The more we try to control how we're perceived, the more unnatural we become. But when we let go of that fear, when we stop thinking so much about how we are being seen, we begin to act more authentically. Before overthinking your actions, ask yourself, am I changing how I act just because I know I'm being watched? Am I worried about how I appear instead of simply being myself? Am I living for my own experience, or am I living for an audience? Am I letting the fear of judgment stop me from acting naturally? The observer's paradox teaches us that true authenticity isn't about ignoring observation, it's about learning not to let it control us. The more we try to control how others see us, the more unnatural we become. But when we stop obsessing over being observed, we can finally act without hesitation, without performance, without fear. So the next time you feel self-conscious about being watched, remember you don't have to act differently just because someone is observing you. Because in the end, the most natural version of yourself is the one that doesn't care who's watching. The Backfire Effect. Why do people sometimes refuse to change their minds, even when faced with clear evidence? Why does proving someone wrong often make them believe their false ideas even more strongly? This is the Backfire Effect, a psychological phenomenon where instead of changing their beliefs when confronted with facts, people dig in deeper. It's one of the strangest contradictions of human thinking. When presented with proof that they are wrong, some people become even more convinced that they are right. At first, this doesn't seem to make sense. If someone believes something that isn't true, you'd expect that showing them clear evidence would make them reconsider. But the Backfire Effect reveals that human beliefs aren't just built on facts, they are deeply connected to identity, emotions, and social groups. Imagine you're having a discussion with a friend who strongly believes in something that isn't true. Maybe they believe in a conspiracy theory, or they completely misremember an event. You show them clear proof that they are wrong, solid evidence, undeniable facts. But instead of reconsidering, they reject the evidence. They find ways to dismiss it, they become defensive, and sometimes they end up believing in their false idea even more strongly than before. This happens because when people are confronted with information that challenges their core beliefs, their brain treats it as a threat. Instead of processing the new information rationally, They instinctively protect their existing belief, just like they would protect themselves from a physical attack. Their mind goes into defense mode, searching for reasons to dismiss the new evidence, rather than accepting it. The backfire effect is especially strong in politics and religion, where beliefs are deeply tied to personal identity. If someone strongly identifies with a political party, and they are presented with proof that their side made a mistake, they don't just see it as an error in policy, they see it as a personal attack. Their belief system is a part of who they are, and changing it feels like losing a part of themselves. This effect has been studied in psychology experiments. In one study, researchers presented people with false information, like a fake news story. Later, they showed those same people solid proof that the story was incorrect. The logical response would be for people to accept the correction, but instead, many participants doubled down on their original belief, defending it even more than before. The facts didn't convince them, they made them more resistant to change. The backfire effect is one of the reasons why debates and arguments rarely change people's minds. When two people strongly disagree, neither side is usually convinced by the other. Instead, each person leaves the argument even more certain that they are right. This paradox explains why misinformation spreads so easily. If someone strongly believes in a false idea, showing them facts won't necessarily help. It might actually make them believe the falsehood even more strongly. This is why fact-checking doesn't always stop fake news, and why conspiracy theories are so hard to break. People aren't just believing facts, they are believing what fits with their existing worldview. So how can we overcome the backfire effect? The key is to avoid direct confrontation. Instead of telling someone they are wrong, a better approach is to ask questions. When people feel like they are discovering information on their own, rather than being forced to accept it, they are more likely to change their minds. Another strategy is to find common ground. Instead of attacking someone's belief, start by agreeing on something small. If people feel like they are being listened to, rather than attacked, they are more open to new ideas. The backfire effect teaches us a powerful lesson. People don't change their minds just because of facts. They change their minds when they feel safe enough to question their own beliefs. So the next time you find yourself in an argument, ask yourself, is the goal to prove you are right, or is the goal to actually change someone's mind? Because sometimes, proving someone wrong only makes them believe in their mistake even more. The bandwagon effect. Why does doing something just because everyone else is doing it often lead to unexpected failure? Why do people sometimes jump onto a trend, only to realize later that it was the wrong decision? This is the bandwagon effect, a powerful psychological phenomenon that makes people adopt behaviors, opinions, or trends simply because other people are doing it. It feels like a shortcut for decision-making. If so many people are doing something, it must be the right choice, right? But more often than not, this effect leads to bad decisions, unexpected consequences, and even large-scale disasters. The bandwagon effect works because humans are wired to follow the crowd. If we see a long line outside a restaurant, we assume the food must be good. If a candidate in an election seems to be winning, we assume they must be the best choice. If a stock price is skyrocketing, we assume it's a great investment. But the truth is, popularity is not the same as quality, and following the crowd doesn't always lead to the best outcomes. Imagine you're in a large crowd, and suddenly, people start running in one direction. Without even thinking, you feel the urge to run with them. You don't know why they're running, you don't know where they're going, but your brain tells you, if everyone is doing it, it must be the right thing to do. This instinct helped early humans survive. If the tribe was fleeing, there was probably a predator or a threat nearby, and running with them increased your chances of survival. But in modern life, this instinct can lead us straight into bad decisions and irrational behaviors. One of the biggest examples of the bandwagon effect happens in financial markets. Investors see others making money on a certain stock, and they rush in without fully understanding what they're buying. This creates economic bubbles, where prices rise simply because people expect them to keep rising. Eventually, reality catches up, the bubble bursts, and millions of people lose money. The dot-com bubble of the late 1990s is a perfect example. Investors poured money into tech companies that had no real profits, just because everyone else was investing. People assumed that if so many others believed in these companies, they must be valuable. But when the bubble burst, trillions of dollars were lost, and many investors realized too late that they had just followed the crowd into financial disaster. The bandwagon effect isn't just about money, It plays a role in politics, social movements, and history. In many elections, people vote for a candidate simply because they seem popular, not because they actually support their policies. Opinion polls and media coverage create the illusion that a certain choice is winning, and people feel pressured to go along with it. In some cases, a leader becomes powerful, not because they are the best choice, but because people believe they are inevitable. This same effect has led to the rise of dangerous political movements throughout history. Many societies have fallen into mass movements not because individuals actually supported them, but because they believed that everyone else did. This is how extremist ideologies spread, not necessarily because people agree, but because they don't want to be left behind. The more people join, the harder it becomes to resist. Social media has made the bandwagon effect stronger than ever. A post with millions of likes appears more trustworthy than one with only a few. A viral trend spreads not because it's good or useful, but because people fear missing out. False information spreads rapidly, because once enough people believe it, others assume it must be true. The result: misinformation, fake news, and viral trends that aren't based on facts, but on sheer momentum. Even in everyday life, the bandwagon effect influences our choices. From fashion trends to music, diets, and technology, people often follow the latest fads, not because they are better, but because they are popular. A product might not be the best, but if everyone is buying it, we assume it must be worth it. So why do we fall for this effect so easily? It comes down to how our brains work. Humans are social creatures, and we instinctively look for signals from others about what to do. This is why laugh tracks are used in TV shows, to make us think something is funnier than it really is. It's why companies use celebrity endorsements, making us believe that if famous people use a product, it must be good. The problem is that when too many people follow the crowd without thinking, bad decisions become unstoppable. This is how financial crashes happen. It's how wars are started. It's how misinformation spreads. When enough people assume that other people know what they're doing, nobody stops to ask if the original idea was even a good one. So how do we escape the bandwagon effect? The key is awareness. The next time you feel the urge to do something just because everyone else is doing it, stop and ask yourself, do I actually believe in this? Is this the right decision for me? Or am I just following the crowd without thinking? Because sometimes the most popular choice is actually the worst one. The bystander effect. Have you ever walked past someone who looked like they needed help but assumed someone else would step in? Have you ever been in a group where something clearly needed to be done, yet nobody took action? You're not alone. This is a psychological phenomenon known as the bystander effect, a paradox where the more people are present, the less likely anyone is to help. At first it seems like common sense to think that a larger crowd means more chances that someone will step in, but in reality, the opposite happens. When many people witness an event, they assume that someone else will take responsibility, and since everyone is thinking the same thing, no one actually does anything. To understand how this works, imagine walking through a busy city when you see someone collapse on the sidewalk. If you were the only person there, you'd likely feel a strong urge to help. But if there were dozens of other people around, you might hesitate. You might think someone else will help, or maybe someone else already called for help. The more people there are, the easier it is to shift responsibility away from yourself, a phenomenon known as diffusion of responsibility. This effect was first studied after a tragic real-world event. In 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked outside her apartment in New York. Reports at the time claimed that dozens of people heard her screams but did nothing. The story shocked the world. How could so many people witness a crime and fail to act? This led to decades of research into what would later be called the bystander effect. Later investigations found that some details of the original story were exaggerated, but the psychological principle remained valid. Over the years, countless experiments have confirmed the same disturbing pattern. When people are alone, they are more likely to help. When they are in a group, they hesitate. One of the most famous experiments involved a room filling with smoke. Participants were placed in a room where smoke started seeping in through a vent. When they were alone, most of them reported the smoke immediately. But when they were in a room with others who ignored the smoke, they also ignored it, even as the room filled with smoke to dangerous levels. Why does this happen? One reason is pluralistic ignorance. When everyone looks to others for cues on how to react, if nobody else seems concerned, we assume there's no reason to act. We don't want to be the only person overreacting, so we wait to see if others take action first. But if everyone is waiting, then nothing happens. The bystander effect doesn't just apply to emergencies, it affects all aspects of life. Have you ever been in a workplace where everyone notices a mistake, but no one speaks up? Maybe there's a major flaw in a project, but everyone assumes someone else will report it. Or perhaps there's a toxic person in the office, but nobody wants to be the one to confront them. The result? The problem continues simply because nobody took responsibility. The same thing happens in schools. When students see someone being bullied, they often stay silent, not necessarily because they approve of the bullying, but because they assume someone else will intervene. Each person in the group feels less personal responsibility, and so nobody acts. Even social media suffers from the bystander effect. A viral post about a missing person, a fundraiser, or an important social issue might be seen by millions of people. But the more people who see it, the more each individual thinks, "I don't need to share this, plenty of others will." In the end, many people see it, but very few actually take action. This paradox has dangerous consequences. In crimes, medical emergencies, and bullying situations, the bystander effect can lead to people suffering needlessly, not because others are cruel, but because everyone assumes that someone else will step in first. So how do we break free from this psychological trap? The key is awareness and responsibility. The next time you see a situation where help is needed, ask yourself, am I waiting for someone else to take action? If I don't step in, will anyone? Would I want someone to help me if I were in this situation? Psychologists have found that the best way to break the bystander effect is through direct responsibility. If you're ever in an emergency and need help, don't just yell for assistance. Point to a specific person and say, "You call an ambulance." This forces that person to recognize their responsibility, making them much more likely to act. Another way to overcome the bystander effect is to train yourself to act first. Studies show that once one person steps in, others follow. People want to help, they just need a signal that it's okay to break the silence. By choosing to act, you can be the one who sets the example. The bystander effect shows us that inaction isn't always about cruelty or selfishness. Sometimes it's just a psychological trap. The next time you see something that needs fixing, ask yourself, am I waiting for someone else to act, or am I going to be the one to step in? Because sometimes the difference between tragedy and rescue is a single person deciding to help, and that person might have to be you. The paradox of choice. Have you ever noticed that the more choices you have, the harder it is to make a decision? Have you ever spent too much time picking a movie to watch, scrolling through an endless menu at a restaurant, or debating between similar products, only to feel frustrated in the end? This is the paradox of choice, a psychological effect that shows how having too many options can make decision-making harder, not easier. While we often think that more choices give us more freedom, research shows that too many choices can actually lead to stress, anxiety, and dissatisfaction. At first, this might seem counterintuitive. After all, isn't having more options supposed to be a good thing? If you walk into a store and see hundreds of types of cereal, you should be able to find the perfect one, right? But in reality, the opposite happens. When we have too many options, we get overwhelmed. Instead of feeling happy, we start feeling paralyzed, afraid of making the wrong choice. Psychologist Barry Schwartz demonstrated this in a famous study at a supermarket. Customers were given two different scenarios. In one, they had to choose between 6 types of jam. In another, they had to choose between 24 types of jam. You might think that having more options would make people buy more jam, but the result was the opposite. People who had fewer choices were 10 times more likely to actually make a purchase. The group with too many choices often walked away without picking anything at all. This is choice paralysis, when too many options make it so hard to decide that we end up not deciding at all. Now imagine this happening in bigger life decisions. Choosing a career, picking a college, deciding where to live. Today, we have more choices than ever before, and while that should be a good thing, it can actually make decisions feel impossible. And when we do finally make a choice, we often feel less satisfied with it. This is because of opportunity cost. The more choices we had, the more we think about the ones we didn't pick. We start wondering, did I make the best choice? Would I have been happier with something else? Even if we made a great decision, the existence of other options makes us doubt ourselves. This paradox appears in modern dating as well. With dating apps, we have access to thousands of potential partners, but instead of making it easier to find the right person, it can make dating more frustrating. The more choices we have, the harder it is to commit. People constantly wonder, is there someone even better out there, leading to a cycle of endless searching and dissatisfaction. It also happens in entertainment. Have you ever spent so long scrolling through Netflix that by the time you finally pick something, you're already tired? This is another side effect of the paradox of choice. Instead of feeling excited about the freedom to choose, we feel exhausted from the pressure of picking the best option. Even in shopping, we fall into this trap. Have you ever gone online to buy something simple, like a pair of shoes, only to find yourself comparing hundreds of similar options, reading reviews, checking prices, and spending hours just trying to make the right choice? And then when you finally order something, you still feel unsure if you picked the best one. So why does this happen? The human brain evolved in a world where choices were limited. Our ancestors didn't have to choose between hundreds of cereals, thousands of jobs, or millions of potential romantic partners. They had a small number of options, and once they made a choice, they moved on. But in today's world, we are bombarded with choices every day, and our brains haven't fully adapted to handle them. Too many choices lead to three major problems. Choice paralysis, when we get so overwhelmed that we can't make a decision at all. Regret and dissatisfaction, even if we make a great choice, we keep thinking about the options we didn't pick. Higher expectations, the more choices we have, the more we expect to find the perfect option. When reality doesn't meet our expectations, we feel disappointed. So how do we overcome the paradox of choice? Key is to simplify decisions and limit choices. When faced with too many options, narrow your choices. Instead of considering every possible option, set a limit. If you're picking a movie, limit yourself to 3 choices instead of scrolling endlessly. Set a time limit. Give yourself a set amount of time to decide, so you don't overthink it. Be okay with good enough. Instead of searching for the perfect choice, pick something that's good enough and move on. Practice gratitude for what you choose. Focus on why you made your choice, rather than wondering about what you didn't pick. Because in the end, having too many choices doesn't always make us happier. Sometimes, the key to satisfaction isn't more options, it's learning to be happy with the choices we make. The Cobra Effect. Why does it feel like solving one problem often creates another? Why do attempts to fix issues sometimes make things worse in the long run? This is the Cobra Effect, a paradox where solutions to problems end up backfiring, making the original issue even more difficult to solve. It's a perfect example of unintended consequences, when well-intentioned actions trigger a chain reaction that creates even bigger problems. The term Cobra Effect comes from a famous historical incident in colonial India. The British government, wanting to reduce the number of deadly cobras in Delhi, introduced a simple incentive, a bounty for every dead cobra turned in. At first this seemed to work. People began bringing in dead cobras, and the population appeared to decline. But then something unexpected happened. People started breeding cobras just to kill them and collect the bounty. When the government discovered this, they quickly scrapped the program. But now, with no financial incentive to keep breeding the cobras, people simply released them into the wild, resulting in more cobras than before. The plan designed to solve a problem had instead made it worse. This same paradox has played out time and time again throughout history. In 1902, the French colonial government in Hanoi, Vietnam, faced a rat infestation. To control the problem, they introduced a bounty for every rat tail turned in. Soon officials were receiving thousands of tails, but they noticed something strange. There were no bodies. People had figured out that they could cut off the tails and release the rats to breed more, ensuring a continuous supply of rewards. Once again, an attempt to fix a problem had only fueled it further. The Cobra Effect isn't just a historical curiosity. It happens everywhere, from economics to public policy to business. In Mexico City, a law was passed to reduce air pollution by banning cars from driving on certain days based on their license plate numbers. The idea was simple: fewer cars on the road would mean cleaner air, but instead of helping, people bought second cars, often older, more polluting vehicles, to get around the restriction. The end result? More pollution than before. In modern finance, this paradox plays out in stock market regulations. After the 2008 financial crisis, banks were required to keep larger reserves of cash to prevent another collapse. But instead of making the system safer, this created a new problem. Banks, wanting to meet regulations, stopped lending as much, slowing down the economy. A policy meant to prevent disaster ended up restricting growth and opportunity. Even social policies fall victim to the Cobra Effect. In the effort to reduce standardized testing pressure, some schools have eliminated difficult tests altogether, hoping to make education more accessible. But instead of helping students, this has sometimes resulted in lower academic standards and less preparation for real-world challenges. The goal was to ease stress, but in doing so, it may have made learning less effective. So why does this happen? Why do solutions backfire? The problem lies in unintended incentives. When a system rewards a certain behavior, people will find ways to exploit the system instead of solving the actual problem. The more complex the issue, the more likely it is that an attempted solution will create side effects that are worse than the original problem. This raises an unsettling question: how do we fix problems without making them worse? The key is to think beyond short-term results and anticipate how people might adapt to the new system. Policies need to focus on long-term effects, not just immediate fixes. Solutions should be tested on a small scale before being widely implemented, and feedback should be continuously analyzed to catch unintended consequences early. The Cobra Effect serves as a powerful reminder that quick fixes often fail, and that good intentions alone are not enough. The next time you see a policy, a rule, or a new system meant to fix a problem, ask yourself, does this actually solve the problem, or does it just create a new one waiting to be discovered? The effort justification paradox. Have you ever worked so hard for something that, even when you realized it wasn't worth it, you couldn't bring yourself to let it go? Maybe it was a bad investment, a failing project, or even a relationship that was making you unhappy. But instead of walking away, you convinced yourself that it had to be worth it, because if it wasn't, that would mean all your effort was wasted. This is the effort justification paradox, a psychological effect that makes us overvalue things simply because we worked hard for them. Instead of admitting that something wasn't worth it, our brains rewrite the story to make us feel like our time and effort were meaningful. Imagine you spend hours assembling a complicated piece of furniture. The process is frustrating, the instructions make no sense, and by the end, the final product is crooked and wobbly. But instead of throwing it away, you convince yourself that it's actually pretty good, maybe even better than if you had bought a pre-assembled one. The harder you worked, the more valuable it feels, even if, objectively, it's a worse product. This paradox plays out everywhere in life, in careers, relationships, hobbies, education, and financial decisions. The more effort we put into something, the more we feel the need to justify that effort, even if the end result isn't worth it. A famous psychology experiment demonstrated this effect in action. Researchers Elliot Aronson and Judson Mills asked college students to join a discussion group. But before joining, some students had to go through an embarrassing and difficult initiation process, while others were admitted easily. The discussion group turned out to be incredibly boring. But here's where it gets strange. The students who had gone through the difficult initiation rated the experience as much more interesting and valuable than those who got in without effort. Why? Because their brains refused to accept that all their effort was for nothing. Instead of admitting that the discussion was dull, they convinced themselves that it was meaningful, because the alternative was too painful. This paradox explains why we stay in careers we hate. Someone who has spent years training for a job they don't enjoy might convince themselves they love it, because the alternative, admitting that all their hard work led them somewhere they don't want to be, is too painful. They might say, "I've already put in so much time, I can't just throw it away." But the real question is, do I want to spend the next 20 years doing something I don't enjoy? It also happens in relationships. People stay in unhappy relationships not because they're happy, but because they've already spent so much time together. They might tell themselves, "We've been through so much, I can't just leave now." But in reality, they're only staying because their effort makes them feel like they have to. Instead of accepting that the relationship isn't working, their brain tells them that all the past effort must have made it valuable. This is also why luxury items feel more valuable than they actually are. If a product is expensive, difficult to obtain, or requires waiting in long lines, our brains trick us into believing it must be better. If we didn't do that, we'd have to admit that we wasted money and effort. The paradox even explains why people defend difficult experiences. Someone who trained hard for a marathon, went through grueling workouts, and suffered through pain might say it was one of the best experiences of their life, even if it was physically miserable. Their brain rewrites the experience to make it feel rewarding, because otherwise, they'd have to admit that all their suffering wasn't worth it. Even parenting is affected by this paradox. Raising children is exhausting, expensive, and full of sacrifice. But parents don't say, "This is awful." Instead, they say, "Being a parent is the most rewarding thing in life." This isn't to say that parenting isn't valuable, but part of that belief comes from the brain justifying the massive effort required to raise a child. The effort justification paradox is also why people defend their past decisions, even when they no longer make sense. Imagine a company that has spent millions of dollars on a failing project. Even when it becomes clear that the project won't succeed, they keep throwing more money into it just because they've already spent so much. Governments do the same thing, funding failed programs for years, instead of cutting their losses. No one wants to admit that their past efforts were wasted, so they keep investing more and more, making the problem even worse. So why does this happen? The answer lies in cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when our actions don't match our beliefs. If we put effort into something, and it turns out to be worthless, that creates a conflict in our minds. Instead of admitting the effort was wasted, we change our perception of reality. We convince ourselves that the effort made it valuable. This is a powerful trick our brains play on us. It's why quitting feels so hard, even when it's the right choice. It's why people defend bad investments, bad relationships, and bad decisions, because admitting we wasted time, money, or effort is painful. So instead, we convince ourselves that we didn't waste it at all. But the truth is, effort doesn't always equal value. Just because something was hard, doesn't mean it was worth it. And just because we've spent years on something, doesn't mean we have to keep going. So how do we escape the effort justification paradox? The key is to separate effort from value. When making decisions, ask yourself, do I actually enjoy this, or am I just convincing myself I do, because it was difficult? If I had started from zero today, would I still choose this path? Am I holding on to something just because I worked hard for it? Am I willing to sacrifice my future just to justify my past? Because in the end, past effort doesn't justify future suffering, and sometimes the smartest choice is to walk away from something that no longer makes sense. The Condorcet Paradox. Why do elections sometimes give us results that make no sense? Why do competitions and rankings sometimes pick winners that almost nobody really wanted? It feels like voting should be simple. The person or option with the most support should win. But sometimes, the way votes are counted creates strange contradictions that go against what most people actually want. This is the Condorcet Paradox, a voting problem that shows how majority rule can sometimes lead to completely illogical results. It happens when a group of people prefers A over B, B over C, and yet C over A. Instead of getting a clear winner, we get a loop, a cycle where no one option truly comes out on top. Let's make this simple. Imagine an election with 3 candidates, Alice, Bob, and Charlie. The voters rank them from best to worst. And when the votes are counted, here's what happens. 40% of voters prefer Alice over Bob and Bob over Charlie. 35% of voters prefer Bob over Charlie and Charlie over Alice. 25% of voters prefer Charlie over Alice and Alice over Bob. Now, let's compare them head to head. Alice beats Bob, Bob beats Charlie, Charlie beats Alice. Wait, how is that possible? Alice is preferred over Bob, Bob is preferred over Charlie. But then, somehow, Charlie is preferred over Alice. Instead of getting a clear winner, we're stuck in an endless loop. This isn't just a weird math trick. It happens in real elections. It happens in award shows, business decisions, and hiring processes. Anytime a group of people has to rank multiple choices, this paradox can appear. And here's where it gets even stranger. Because of this cycle, a less popular option can sometimes end up winning. If there's no clear majority, the way votes are counted might allow someone to win just because the numbers split in a certain way. Imagine a presidential election with 3 major candidates. If the votes split in a way that creates a cycle, the winner might not be the most liked candidate overall. They just happen to have the right combination of votes to take advantage of the paradox. This has happened in real life. In some elections, a candidate has won with only a small percentage of votes, even though the majority of people would have preferred someone else. The same thing happens in award shows, where a movie or song that almost no one ranked as their favorite still wins, just because of how the votes were counted. It's not just politics. This paradox also affects business decisions. Imagine a company's leadership team needs to pick a new CEO. The board members rank their choices, but because of the way their preferences overlap, a less qualified candidate might end up being chosen just because the votes create a loop instead of a clear winner. This problem has been studied for centuries. In fact, it's named after the French mathematician Nicolas de Condorcet, who first noticed it in the 18th century. He realized that when people vote in ranked systems, cycles can appear, creating elections with no true winner. So how do we fix this? How do we prevent the Condorcet paradox from influencing major decisions? Some systems use ranked choice voting, where the least popular candidates are eliminated and votes are redistributed. Others use runoff elections, where voters pick again from the top two choices. These methods try to avoid the paradox by narrowing down the choices until a real majority emerges. But even with these fixes, the deeper problem remains. What does it actually mean for something to be the best choice? If different groups of people always prefer different things, how do we decide who or what should win? The Condorcet paradox forces us to question whether majority rule always works the way we think it does. If voting itself can create contradictions, then how can we ever be sure that an election truly reflects what people want? So the next time you hear about a surprising election result, a controversial award, or a strange political outcome, ask yourself, did the best choice actually win? Or did the system fall into a paradox that no one even noticed? The paradox of control. Have you ever wondered why the more we try to control something, the more chaotic it becomes? Why do strict rules sometimes lead to rebellion? Why do attempts to manage people, markets, or even nature often result in the exact opposite of what was intended? This is the paradox of control, a fascinating and often frustrating reality, where the more tightly we try to manage or influence a system, the less predictable and stable it becomes. It happens because control creates resistance, complexity, and unintended consequences that make the system behave in ways we never expected. At first, the logic behind control seems obvious. If you want something to function properly, you set rules, enforce discipline, and minimize unpredictability. But in reality, many systems are too complex to be controlled directly. The harder we try to force them into a predictable shape, the more they push back, often leading to more instability, not less. One of the clearest examples of this paradox is seen in economics. Governments often try to control economies by setting price limits, regulating industries, or manipulating currency values. While these interventions may seem necessary, history has shown that excessive control can create black markets, inefficiency, and economic collapse. Take rent control as an example. In cities with skyrocketing housing costs, governments sometimes impose caps on rent prices to keep housing affordable, but instead of making more housing available, this often has the opposite effect. With no incentive to invest in new properties, landlords stop building new apartments or let existing buildings decay. Over time, the housing crisis worsens because the control mechanism choked the system instead of fixing it. Another example is over-policing. While strong law enforcement is necessary for safety, studies show that excessive policing and aggressive crackdowns often increase crime rather than reducing it. When communities feel over-controlled, trust in authority decreases, and people start resisting, protesting, or even rebelling against the very system meant to protect them. This is why strict authoritarian regimes often face more unrest than free societies, because the more you try to force obedience, the more people push back. The paradox of control also appears in parenting and education. Have you ever seen parents who are overly strict with their children, only for those kids to rebel as soon as they get a taste of freedom? Many teenagers with overly controlling parents end up acting out, lying, or even running away because the intense restrictions make them feel trapped. Instead of creating discipline, excessive control often creates resentment and defiance. The same happens in education. Schools that are too focused on strict rules, rigid curriculums, and standardized testing often kill creativity and motivation rather than improve learning. Students don't thrive under constant pressure and micromanagement. They learn best when they have some level of freedom to explore ideas and make their own choices. In business, the the paradox of control shows up in micromanagement. Many leaders believe that closely monitoring employees ensures higher productivity, but research shows that micromanaged employees often become less motivated, more anxious, and less productive. When people feel like they have no autonomy, they stop thinking independently and become passive, waiting for orders rather than taking initiative. Even in nature, this paradox plays out in unexpected ways. For decades, forest management programs tried to prevent all wildfires to protect ecosystems. But by stopping small natural fires, they allowed dead plants and dry wood to accumulate, leading to bigger, uncontrollable wildfires. By trying to control nature too much, we made it far more destructive. The paradox of control is also seen in mental health. People who struggle with anxiety often try to control every aspect of their lives to prevent bad things from happening. But the more they try to control everything, the more anxious they become, because it's impossible to manage every outcome. In the end, their need for control only makes their fear stronger, trapping them in a cycle of stress and exhaustion. So why does this happen? The answer is that control isn't the same as stability. The more complex a system is, whether it's a society, an economy, or even the human mind, the less effective direct control becomes. Instead of making things run smoothly, excessive control creates friction, inefficiency, and unintended consequences. This is why some of history's greatest collapses happened, not because of too little control, but because of too much. From ancient empires that collapsed under the weight of bureaucracy, to modern corporations that crumbled due to over-regulation, history shows that systems thrive best when they have flexibility, not rigid control. So how do we escape the paradox of control? The key is balance. Instead of forcing rigid control, we should aim for adaptive management, a system where rules exist, but with room for flexibility and self-regulation. Before imposing strict control over anything, ask, am I actually making things better, or just creating more resistance? Is this level of control necessary, or am I micromanaging? What are the unintended side effects of this control? Would loosening control in some areas create a healthier balance? The most successful societies, businesses, and individuals understand that true stability comes not from rigid control, but from adaptability. The more we try to force control, the more chaos we create. But when we trust natural systems, empower people, and allow flexibility, things often work out better than we expected. So the next time you feel the urge to control something tightly, take a step back. Ask yourself, is control really the solution, or am I just making the system more fragile? Because sometimes, the best way to create order is to let go of control. The Crocodile Paradox. Imagine you are standing by a river, watching the water flow. The surface ripples, currents shift, and droplets merge into the endless stream. Now ask yourself this: if you step into the river, leave for a moment, and then step back in, are you stepping into the same river, or a different one? The water you touched before is now far downstream, replaced by something new, and yet you still call it the same river. Now imagine something else, something far stranger. A crocodile suddenly emerges from the water, snapping its jaws and seizing a child standing at the river's edge. The desperate parent pleads with the crocodile, begging for their child's return. The crocodile, being a creature of logic rather than mercy, offers a deal. I will return your child, the crocodile says, but only if you can correctly guess what I will do next. At first, this might seem like a fair challenge. If the parent correctly predicts the crocodile's decision, they get their child back. But this is where things get complicated. What should the parent say? If they guess, you will return my child, and the crocodile was already planning to return the child, then the guess is correct, and the crocodile follows through. But what if the crocodile had no intention of returning the child? In that case, the guess is wrong, and according to the crocodile's own rules, it is free to keep the child. So maybe the parent tries something different. Maybe they guess, you will keep my child. Now the crocodile is trapped in a logical contradiction. If this guess is correct, then the crocodile must return the child. But if the crocodile does return the child, then the guess was actually wrong. And if the guess was wrong, then the crocodile must keep the child. But that would mean the guess was right all along. No matter what the crocodile chooses to do, the logic of the situation contradicts itself. The rules break down. The crocodile cannot follow through on its promise without creating a paradox. This is the Crocodile Paradox, an ancient thought experiment about knowledge, logic, and uncertainty. It exposes a fundamental problem in self-referential statements that refer to themselves and collapse under their own weight. The moment logic loops back on itself, contradictions emerge, and reality becomes unstable. At its core, this paradox asks, can we ever truly predict the future? Can we ever be certain about what we know? It's a problem that goes far beyond a hungry crocodile and an unlucky parent. Imagine a courtroom where a judge declares, "I will only convict the accused if they are guilty." Seems fair, right? But now imagine that the accused is convicted without solid evidence. If the judge was wrong, then the conviction itself was unjust, meaning it never should have happened. But if it never should have happened, then the accused should have been innocent, which means the judge was wrong again. Like the crocodile's twisted game, the logic of justice and certainty starts to break down. Or consider artificial intelligence. Modern AI is designed to predict human behavior, but the moment people become aware of those predictions, they start to behave differently. If an AI predicts that a stock will rise, investors rush in to buy, causing the stock price to rise, not because the AI was correct, but because people acted on the prediction. But what if the AI had predicted a fall instead? Would that prediction have shaped reality in the opposite direction? This problem appears in economics, politics, even time travel. If you could go back in time and predict a historical event before it happened, would your very presence change the future? Would the knowledge of what is about to unfold create a different outcome altogether? And then there's the deepest, most unsettling version of the paradox: free will itself. If the future is already determined, then every choice you make is an illusion. But if the future is uncertain, then how can anything ever be predicted at all? The Crocodile Paradox forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Certainty is an illusion. We like to believe we understand how the world works, that we can predict events, control outcomes, and navigate reality with confidence. But the moment logic starts looping back on itself, contradictions appear. And just like the crocodile's twisted logic, reality becomes something we can never fully hold on to. So the next time you think you know something for certain, ask yourself, is knowledge something real? Or are we all just making guesses, hoping that the crocodile keeps its word? The paradox of equality. Why do attempts to make things fair sometimes lead to even greater unfairness? Why does trying to level the playing field sometimes make things worse for everyone? This is the paradox of equality, a strange contradiction that reveals how efforts to create fairness can, in some cases, lead to the opposite outcome. It challenges our understanding of justice, opportunity, and what it really means to be equal. At first, the idea of equality seems simple. Everyone should have the same chances, the same resources, and the same opportunities. If two people start from the same place, they should have the same likelihood of success. But reality is more complicated. Some people begin with advantages, better education, wealthier families, stronger social connections, while others face barriers that make success more difficult. To fix this, societies try to introduce policies that promote fairness. But here's where the paradox appears. Sometimes, making things equal on the surface actually deepens inequality beneath it. Imagine a race where runners start from different positions. One person is 100 meters ahead, while another starts far behind. To make the race equal, the organizers decide that everyone must begin from the same starting line. On the surface, this looks fair. Everyone is treated the same. But the person who was ahead has now lost nothing, while the person who was already behind is still behind. By ignoring the differences that existed before the race began, this equality actually reinforces the original advantage. This paradox appears in real life in education. Schools often implement policies to make grading fair, such as giving every student the same amount of time to complete an exam. But if one student has access to tutors, private lessons, and a quiet study environment, while another has none of those things, then giving them the same test under the same conditions isn't actually fair at all. The illusion of equality hides deeper inequalities. The same thing happens in hiring and employment. Some companies insist on hiring purely based on merit, treating every applicant as if they had the same opportunities to succeed. But if one person had access to elite schools, professional mentorship, and career connections, while another had to struggle just to afford education, then judging them only by their resumes doesn't truly measure ability. It just rewards those who were already ahead. This is where equity comes in, a different approach that aims to correct past disadvantages rather than just enforcing surface-level equality. Equity recognizes that some people need more help than others to reach the same level of success. It's the difference between giving everyone the same size ladder and giving each person the ladder they actually need to reach the same height. But this is where the paradox deepens, because attempts to enforce equity can sometimes lead to resentment and new forms of unfairness. Imagine a workplace where promotions are based on ensuring equal representation rather than individual performance. Some employees might feel that others are being advanced not because of their skills, but because of policies designed to balance the numbers. If people believe that fairness is being sacrificed, trust in the system can break down, leading to division instead of unity. This paradox appears in economic systems as well. Governments often try to redistribute wealth to create more fairness through progressive taxation, social programs, or financial aid. But if those who contribute more to the system feel that they are being unfairly burdened, they may withdraw their efforts, relocate their wealth, or resist the system entirely, making the entire economy weaker. The attempt to create fairness can sometimes reduce overall prosperity, leaving fewer resources for everyone. So how do we balance equality and fairness? How do we create a system where opportunity is real, but effort and skill still matter? The paradox of equality forces us to confront a difficult truth. Fairness is more than just treating everyone the same. True fairness requires recognizing the differences people start with and adjusting systems in a way that lifts everyone up without creating new inequalities. It's a problem without a simple solution. But the next time you hear about a policy designed to create fairness, ask yourself, is it truly making things more equal, or is it just shifting inequality to a different place? The paradox of fixing. Have you ever noticed that some problems seem to get worse the more we try to fix them? Have you ever worked hard to solve an issue, only to realize later that your solution actually made things even more complicated? This is the paradox of fixing, a strange and frustrating reality where our attempts to solve problems often create new, unexpected problems, sometimes worse than the original issue. It happens because many problems are complex, and changing one part of a system can have ripple effects that we don't anticipate. At first, it seems logical that when something is broken, the right thing to do is fix it. But in reality, problems aren't always as straightforward as they seem. Sometimes our solutions treat symptoms instead of root causes. Other times they create side effects that require even more fixes, leading to an endless cycle of intervention. One of the clearest examples of this paradox is traffic congestion. Many cities have tried to reduce traffic by building more roads or expanding highways. At first it seems like a great idea. More lanes should mean less congestion, right? But what actually happens is something called induced demand. As roads get bigger, more people start driving, and before long the congestion is just as bad, sometimes even worse. The very thing that was meant to solve the problem ends up making it worse. Another example is in medicine. Painkillers help people manage chronic pain, but when overused, they can lead to addiction and dependency, which then creates an entirely new crisis. The same thing happens with sleeping pills. People take them to fix insomnia, but over time their body builds tolerance, and they need even higher doses just to sleep. The short-term fix creates a long-term problem. The paradox of fixing is also visible in economics. Governments often try to boost economies by printing more money or lowering interest rates. At first, this puts more money into circulation and stimulates spending. But over time this can lead to inflation, where prices rise and the money becomes less valuable, creating a whole new set of economic problems. The solution just shifts the problem somewhere else. Even in nature, this paradox plays out. Forest management agencies have spent decades preventing small wildfires to protect the environment, but by stopping those natural fires they allow dry vegetation to build up, which later fuels larger, more destructive fires. The attempt to fix wildfires ended up making them worse over time. In education, many schools have tried to improve student performance by focusing on standardized testing. The idea was that testing would give an objective measure of learning, but instead, teachers started teaching to the test, focusing on memorization rather than real understanding. The result? Higher test scores, but students who struggle with real-world problem solving. The paradox also appears in social policies. Governments sometimes try to reduce poverty by offering financial assistance, which can help in the short term. But if the system isn't designed carefully, it can create dependency, where people become stuck in a cycle of relying on aid instead of becoming self-sufficient. What was meant to help people escape poverty ends up trapping them in it. Even in personal relationships, the paradox of fixing appears. Have you ever tried to help someone solve their problems, only to realize that they started depending on you instead of figuring things out on their own? Sometimes, offering too much help prevents people from developing the skills they need to handle challenges themselves. So why does this happen? Why do fixes so often backfire? The reason is that many problems are part of complex systems. A change in one part of the system doesn't just solve a problem, it shifts the balance in ways that are hard to predict. The fix might work for a while, but then new issues emerge, often requiring even more fixes. This is why some of the worst problems in history weren't caused by bad intentions, but by bad solutions. People meant well, they tried to fix things, but they didn't think about long-term effects or how the system would react to their intervention. So how do we escape the paradox of fixing? The key is to focus on understanding the real problem before rushing to fix it. Before taking action, ask, is this treating the symptom or the root cause? What unintended side effects could this create? Are we creating long-term stability or just temporary relief? Will this fix lead to more intervention later? Sometimes the best solution isn't to immediately fix a problem, but to observe it first, understand its deeper causes, and address it in a way that doesn't create even bigger problems later. Because sometimes the fastest way to break something is to try too hard to fix it. The paradox of originality. Have you ever noticed that the more you try to be original, the harder it becomes? That when you set out to create something truly unique, you often find yourself copying what's already been done. Have you ever tried to think outside the box, only to realize that your new idea has been done before? This is the paradox of originality, a strange and frustrating truth about creativity. It reveals that the harder we try to be original, the more likely we are to repeat what already exists. The more we consciously seek to be different, the more we end up trapped by the very ideas we're trying to escape. At first, this seems counterintuitive. We often assume that originality is about rejecting the past, about carving out something completely new. But in reality, every new idea is built on the ideas that came before it. The very act of trying to be original forces us to compare ourselves to what has already been done, making it harder to escape old patterns. Take music, for example. Every musician wants to create a fresh new sound, but every musical style is influenced by what came before. Rock, jazz, hip-hop, and electronic music all evolved from earlier genres. Even the most groundbreaking artists like the Beatles, Jimi Hendrix, or Kanye West were inspired by past musicians. When artists try too hard to be different, they often end up sounding forced, unnatural, or even like a remix of existing ideas. The same paradox exists in writing and storytelling. Have you ever tried to come up with a completely original story, only to realize that your idea is similar to something else? That's because all stories are built on universal patterns: the hero's journey, the rise and fall, the struggle for identity. Even science fiction and fantasy, which seem limitless in their possibilities, often follow ancient myths and folklore. No matter how hard we try to create something new, we are still working with the same fundamental building blocks of storytelling. Even in science and philosophy, originality is an illusion. Many of the ideas we consider revolutionary, Einstein's theory of relativity, Darwin's evolution, quantum mechanics, were not created in isolation. They were built on centuries of previous knowledge. Einstein himself said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." No great idea appears from nowhere. It is always shaped by what came before. The paradox of originality is also seen in fashion and design. Every generation thinks they are reinventing style, but in reality, fashion is cyclical. Trends from past decades constantly resurface. What was outdated eventually becomes cool again. The same happens in architecture, interior design, and visual arts. What feels new today often turns out to be a reimagining of something old. This paradox even affects technology and innovation. Many of today's most innovative products, smartphones, social media, electric cars, are just refinements of old ideas. The smartphone is just an evolution of the telephone and personal computer. Electric cars existed over a century ago, but only recently became mainstream. Even groundbreaking companies like Tesla and Apple didn't invent something entirely new. They perfected existing technologies. So why does this happen? Why is it so hard to create something truly original? One reason is that human creativity is shaped by our environment. We don't invent ideas from nothing. We remix, reassemble, and reinterpret what we already know. The brain is not a generator of pure originality. It's a pattern recognition machine that constantly makes connections between existing concepts. Another reason is that true originality is often unrecognizable at first. Some of the most revolutionary ideas in history were ignored or rejected when they first appeared, because they didn't fit into existing frameworks. The Impressionist painters, who transformed art, were dismissed by critics. The first abstract music was called noise. Many of the greatest thinkers were seen as crazy before they were considered geniuses. True originality doesn't look like what we expect, so we often overlook it. This paradox also explains why creative blocks happen. When people try too hard to be original, they put too much pressure on themselves. They focus so much on avoiding cliches that they overthink and end up producing nothing. Ironically, some of the most creative breakthroughs happen when people stop trying so hard, when they let go of the fear of imitation and allow ideas to flow naturally. So how do we escape the paradox of originality? The key is to stop obsessing over being different and focus on being authentic. Instead of forcing originality, embrace the idea that everything is a remix, and that's okay. Before creating something, ask yourself, am I trying too hard to be different? Instead of focusing on what feels true to me, am I rejecting ideas just because they resemble something else, even if they feel right? Am I allowing myself to build on the ideas of the past, rather than trying to erase them? Am I open to originality happening naturally, instead of forcing it? The truth is, originality is not about rejecting the past, it's about reinterpreting it in a way that feels fresh and meaningful. The greatest artists, thinkers, and innovators didn't try to be different just for the sake of being different. They took what existed, combined it in new ways, and made it their own. The paradox of originality teaches us that nothing is truly original, but everything is unique in its own way. Every story, every invention, every idea is a continuation of something that came before it. But that doesn't mean creativity is meaningless. It means that the magic of originality isn't in creating something from nothing. It's in taking what exists and making it feel new again. So the next time you feel trapped by the pressure to be original, remember you don't have to invent something entirely new to create something meaningful. True creativity comes not from rejecting the past, but from embracing it and transforming it into something personal. Because in the end, originality isn't about being different for the sake of it. It's about expressing yourself in a way that only you can. Zeno's paradox. Imagine you are standing at the starting line of a race. The finish line is in the distance, and all you have to do is reach it. Simple, right? But what if I told you that getting there is impossible? No matter how hard you try, no matter how fast you run, you will never actually reach the finish line. This is Zeno's paradox, one of the most famous and mind-bending thought experiments in history. It was created by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Abilene over 2,000 years ago, and it challenges one of the most basic assumptions about reality, that movement is even possible. The paradox works like this: before you can reach the finish line, you must first get halfway there. But before you can get halfway, you must get a quarter of the way. And before you can reach a quarter, you must travel 1/8 of the way. This continues infinitely. There will always be another fraction of the distance to cover before you get to your destination. So how could you ever reach the finish line if there are an infinite number of steps you must take first? At first, this paradox seems ridiculous. You know from experience that you can walk across a room, run a race, or drive to a destination without getting stuck in an infinite series of steps. But Zeno's argument presents a logical problem. If space is infinitely divisible, then movement requires completing an infinite number of tasks. And if it takes any amount of time to complete each of those tasks, no matter how small, then it seems like you should never be able to reach your goal. Zeno actually came up with multiple paradoxes about motion, and they all aim to prove the same point, that what we perceive as movement is an illusion, and reality is not what it seems. Another version of this paradox is Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine the great Greek warrior Achilles is in a foot race against a slow-moving tortoise. To be fair, the tortoise is given a small head start. Now, when Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise started, the tortoise has moved a little further ahead. By the time Achilles reaches that new position, the tortoise has again moved forward. No matter how fast Achilles runs, the tortoise will always be slightly ahead. The gap keeps shrinking, but because there are an infinite number of points, Achilles must reach where the tortoise has just been. It seems like he will never actually catch up. Of course, in reality, we know that Achilles would overtake the tortoise quickly. But Zeno's reasoning suggests that because motion involves crossing an infinite number of points, it should be logically impossible. So what's going on here? How can movement be both impossible and clearly real? For centuries, philosophers and mathematicians wrestled with Zeno's paradoxes. The breakthrough didn't come until the development of calculus by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. They introduced the concept of limits, showing that an infinite sum of ever smaller distances can still add up to a finite number. In other words, just because a task can be divided infinitely doesn't mean it requires an infinite amount of time to complete. Modern mathematics resolves the paradox, but its deeper implications still provoke thought. It forces us to ask, is reality continuous, or is it made up of discrete, indivisible units? If space and time are infinitely divisible, does that mean they are illusions? And if what we perceive as motion is just a series of still frames stitched together by our minds, then what does that say about our experience of time? Are we really moving through the world, or is motion just something our brains create? So the next time you go for a walk, think about this. Are you really moving, or are you just infinitely dividing space in a way that makes movement seem possible? The paradox of progress. Have you ever noticed that the more we try to make life easier, the more complicated it becomes? That the more technology advances, the busier we seem to get? Have you ever found yourself drowning in choices, responsibilities, and distractions, despite the fact that modern life is supposed to be more convenient than ever before? This is the paradox of progress, a strange contradiction in which technological and societal advancements, instead of making life simpler and more enjoyable, often make it more stressful, overwhelming, and complicated. The very things designed to save us time often consume more of it. The things meant to bring us freedom sometimes trap us in new ways. At first, progress seems like an obvious good. Every new invention, every new breakthrough promises to make life better. We have smartphones to keep us connected, apps to help us stay productive, and endless sources of entertainment at our fingertips. But instead of feeling free, many people feel busier, more distracted, and more anxious than ever before. Take communication, for example. Decades ago, if you wanted to talk to someone, you either met them in person, wrote a letter, or made a phone call. Today we have emails, text messages, social media, video calls, and endless notifications, yet people often feel more disconnected than ever. The ability to communicate instantly hasn't necessarily made relationships stronger. Instead, it has demanded constant availability, where people feel pressure to respond immediately, manage multiple conversations at once, and never fully disconnect or consider productivity. Technology has given us automation, smart tools, and AI assistants that should, in theory, reduce our workload. But instead of working less, people feel busier than ever. The more efficient we become, the more expectations increase. Work follows us home through emails and remote meetings. What was once a 40-hour work week has, for many, turned into an always-on lifestyle. Instead of reducing stress, progress has often raised the standards to impossible levels. The same paradox appears in consumer choices. In the past, if you needed to buy a pair of shoes, you went to a store, found a pair that fit, and bought them. Simple. Today, online shopping gives us thousands of options. We read endless reviews, compare prices across multiple websites, and spend hours trying to make the perfect choice. But the more choices we have, the harder it becomes to decide. Instead of enjoying the freedom of choice, we feel paralyzed by it. This is why happiness levels in developed countries haven't increased despite massive advancements in technology and wealth. Studies show that once people's basic needs are met, more money, more possessions, and more convenience don't necessarily make them happier. In fact, in many cases, they make life more stressful and complex. Even entertainment suffers from the paradox of progress. Think about streaming services. We now have thousands of movies and TV shows available instantly, but instead of making it easier to pick something to watch, it often leads to decision fatigue. People spend more time scrolling through options than actually enjoying a movie. The endless choices don't bring more satisfaction, they bring more stress. Another major example of this paradox is health and fitness. Modern medicine and nutrition science have given us more knowledge than ever about how to be healthy. We have calorie tracking apps, wearable fitness devices, and endless health advice. But instead of making people healthier, obesity and chronic diseases are on the rise. The more information we have, the more confusing it becomes. Should you follow keto, vegan, intermittent fasting, or paleo? Should you do cardio, strength training, or yoga? Instead of being simpler, staying healthy has become a full-time job. Even in parenting, the paradox of progress appears. In the past, parents raised children based on traditions and instinct. Today, parents have thousands of books, blogs, and experts telling them how to raise a child correctly. But instead of making parenting easier, this flood of information has increased anxiety. Parents second-guess every decision, feeling constant pressure to do everything perfectly. More knowledge hasn't created more confidence, it has created more fear of getting it wrong. So why does this happen? Why does progress often make life more complicated instead of easier? One reason is that every new advancement brings new expectations. Before smartphones, no one expected you to reply to messages instantly. Before streaming services, you weren't expected to stay updated on dozens of TV shows. Before social media, you weren't constantly bombarded with comparisons to other people's lives. Every improvement raises the standard of what is considered normal, making it harder and harder to keep up. Another reason is that efficiency doesn't always mean better quality of life. Faster communication doesn't always mean better conversations. More productivity tools don't always mean less work. More choices don't always mean greater satisfaction. Sometimes, simplicity is lost in the pursuit of progress. So how do we escape the paradox of progress? The key is intentionality, learning to choose progress wisely instead of letting it control us. Before adopting a new technology, habit, or system, ask yourself, is this actually making my life better, or just more complicated? Am I using technology as a tool, or is it using me? Am I adding more to my life, or should I be subtracting? Is this progress improving my well-being, or just making me feel busier? Some of the happiest and most successful people today aren't those who chase every new advancement, but those who know what to ignore. They set boundaries with technology, focus on deep work instead of constant busyness, and simplify their lives instead of endlessly optimizing. This is why movements like minimalism, digital detoxing, and slow living have become more popular, because people are realizing that true progress isn't about adding more, but about focusing on what truly matters. The paradox of progress teaches us that not all progress is equal. Just because something is newer, faster, or more advanced doesn't mean it's better. Sometimes, the key to a better life isn't more technology, more options, or more efficiency. It's learning when to stop chasing progress and start enjoying the present. So the next time you feel overwhelmed by choices, by technology, by the endless pursuit of more, pause. Ask yourself, is this progress making my life better, or just making it harder to live? Because sometimes, the fastest way forward is to slow down. The framing effect. Imagine you're at a grocery store comparing two yogurt brands. One says 90% fat-free, while the other says contains 10% fat. Both mean the exact same thing, but one feels healthier. Without even realizing it, your brain is being tricked into seeing a difference where there is none. This is the framing effect, a psychological phenomenon that shows how the way information is presented can completely change how we perceive it, even if the facts themselves stay the same. It happens because our brains don't just process raw numbers or facts, we react emotionally to how they're framed. A decision that sounds positive is more appealing than the same decision framed negatively, even if both mean the same thing. One of the most famous studies on this effect involved doctors choosing a medical treatment. They were given two options. Option A: if you choose this treatment, 200 out of 600 people will survive. Option B: if you choose this treatment, 400 out of 600 people will die. Logically, these are the same. The number of survivors and deaths doesn't change. But most people preferred the first option, simply because it was framed in terms of saving lives instead of losing them. The wording changed the way people felt about the decision, even though mathematically, both options were identical. The framing effect influences almost every aspect of our lives, from politics to finance, from advertising to social media. In politics, a law might be described as helping 80% of people or failing 20% of people. Same numbers, different emotional impact. If a politician wants to make a policy sound successful, they'll focus on the percentage of people it helps. If they want to criticize it, they'll focus on the people it leaves behind. Either way, they aren't changing the facts, just how you feel about them. In finance, an investment might be advertised as having an 80% chance of gains instead of a 20% chance of losses. A bank might say, 99% of our customers are satisfied, instead of 1% of our customers have complaints. Even though the numbers don't change, one version feels much more reassuring than the other. It's also why fear-based advertising works so well. A toothpaste brand saying 8 out of 10 dentists recommend this sounds trustworthy. But if it said 2 out of 10 dentists do not recommend this, suddenly, doubt creeps in, even though the statistic is the same. Social media takes the framing effect to another level. News headlines are often written to trigger emotions rather than inform. If a report says unemployment is at 10%, it makes the situation seem bad. But if the same report says employment is at 90%, it sounds like things are going well. Both statements are true, but they create very different reactions. And this goes beyond statistics. It affects how we see people and events. Imagine reading an article that describes a protest as a fight for justice. Now imagine another article about the exact same protest, but this time it calls it a violent riot. The facts of the event haven't changed, just the way it's framed. And that framing completely changes how people interpret what happened. The framing effect can even shape how we think about ourselves. If you get a test score of 70%, you could focus on the fact that you got most of the questions right and feel good about your performance. Or you could focus on the 30% you got wrong and feel like you failed. The score is the same, but the way you frame it affects how you feel about it. And that feeling can shape your motivation, your confidence, and your decisions. But perhaps the most dangerous impact of this effect is in how we make big life choices. The way health risks, financial opportunities, or political decisions are framed can manipulate our emotions without us even realizing it. If someone wants to influence you, they don't need to change the facts, they just need to change how those facts are presented. So how do you avoid falling for the framing effect? The key is to pause and reframe the information yourself. When you hear a statistic, try flipping it. If something is framed positively, try looking at it from the negative side, or vice versa. Ask yourself, would I feel differently if this were worded another way? Am I making this decision based on facts, or based on how those facts make me feel? Who is presenting this information, and what do they want me to think? Because once you see the frame, you can start thinking outside of it. And once you do that, you take back control over how you see the world. The friendship paradox. Why does it feel like your friends have more friends than you do? You look around at your social circle, and it always seems like everyone else is more connected, more social, more popular. It's almost as if you're on the outside looking in, like you're part of the group, but somehow, everyone else is closer to each other than they are to you. This isn't just your imagination. Statistically speaking, your friends probably do have more friends than you. This strange and counterintuitive reality is called the friendship paradox. First identified by sociologist Scott Feld in 1991, it reveals that on average, most people's friends have more friends than they do. But how is that possible? How can most people have fewer friends than their own friends? It all comes down to the structure of social networks. Most people have a small number of friends, while a few highly popular individuals have an extremely large number of connections. These highly connected individuals are more likely to appear in multiple people's social circles, skewing the perception of friendship. Think about it like this. Imagine a small town where most people have 3 or 4 close friends, but there's one extremely outgoing person, let's call them Alex, who is friends with hundreds of people. If you randomly select a person in town and check their friend group, there's a high chance that Alex will be part of it. So when most people compare their own number of friends to their friends' numbers, they will likely see that their friends, especially those like Alex, have more connections than they do. In simple terms, friendship is not evenly distributed. People with more connections appear in more social circles, giving the illusion that most people are more socially connected than they really are. But this paradox doesn't just apply to friendship, it extends to almost every networked system in existence. Take social media. If you scroll through your feed, you'll notice something. Your friends probably post more often than you do. That's because the most active users are also the ones most likely to appear in your network. If you're following dozens of people, but a few of them post constantly, their presence will dominate your feed, making it seem like everyone is always posting, when in reality, most people rarely do. The friendship paradox also appears in academics. If you're a researcher, it may seem like all of your colleagues are publishing more papers than you, but this is an illusion. The most prolific researchers, the ones who publish the most, are also the most widely connected. So when you compare yourself to your peers, you're likely to be comparing yourself to people who are publishing far more than the average person. Even in wealth and success, this paradox plays out. If you look at your professional network, it may feel like everyone you know is doing better than you, getting promotions, making more money, achieving more success. But that's because the most visible people in any network are the ones who stand out, creating a distorted reality where it seems like everyone is ahead. And now for the most unsettling version of the friendship paradox: happiness. Studies have shown that, statistically speaking, your friends are probably happier than you are. If the most social and outgoing people are also the ones who are most likely to appear in your social network, and if they also happen to share more of their positive moments, then your perception of how happy everyone else is becomes deeply skewed. It's not that your friends are actually happier, it's just that the happiest, most active people are the ones whose lives you see the most. But here's the most dangerous part of all. The friendship paradox doesn't just affect what we see, it affects how we feel. If it seems like everyone around you is more popular, more successful, or happier than you, you might start questioning yourself. You might feel inadequate, lonely, or even left behind. This effect is amplified by social media, where people only share the best parts of their lives. You don't see their struggles, their bad days, their insecurities. You only see the highlights, the perfectly curated moments. And because of the friendship paradox, those highly visible people shape your entire perception of what life is supposed to be. But the truth is, it's just an illusion. The paradox isn't showing you reality, it's showing you a statistical distortion of reality. The network is tricking you, making it seem like you are on the outside looking in, when in fact almost everyone else feels the same way. And so the next time you scroll through your feed, wondering why everyone seems to have more friends, more fun, or more success than you, remember this: they probably don't. The paradox is lying to you. And if the paradox is lying to you, how many of your own beliefs about yourself are based on an illusion? The gambler's fallacy. Why do we believe the universe will balance itself out? Why does it feel like after a streak of bad luck, good luck is just around the corner? This is the gambler's fallacy, a powerful illusion that makes us think past events can somehow influence random outcomes. It tricks our brains into believing that chance has a memory, that after a series of losses, a win is due to happen. But randomness doesn't work that way, and falling for this illusion can lead to some of the biggest mistakes in gambling, investing, decision-making, and even justice. To understand how this works, imagine flipping a fair coin. The first flip lands on heads, the second is heads again, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. At this point, many people instinctively believe that tails is bound to happen next. After all, how long can heads possibly continue before tails finally appears? But here's the truth: the probability of tails on the next flip is still exactly 50%. The coin doesn't remember what happened before. Each flip is independent of the last, and there is no universal law that forces randomness to even out. But the human brain struggles to accept this. This is why gamblers at a roulette table will see red appear 5 times in a row and suddenly feel compelled to bet on black. It's why people play the lottery for years, believing that after so many failed attempts, their win must be coming soon. But each spin, each ticket, each roll of the dice is just as random as the last, and past results have no effect on future ones. The gambler's fallacy isn't just about casinos, it influences real-world decisions in ways that can have serious consequences. Take financial markets. Investors often believe that if a stock has been going down for weeks, it's due for a rebound. But just because something has been falling doesn't mean it has to rise. Stocks move based on external factors, not past trends alone. Many traders lose fortunes by betting on something that feels overdue to reverse, only to watch it continue in the same direction. The fallacy also affects justice systems. In a study of asylum judges, researchers found that if a judge had granted asylum to several applicants in a row, they were more likely to deny the next one, as if balancing things out. But each case is supposed to be decided on its own merits, not based on what happened before. And then there's healthcare. Some people believe that if they haven't been sick in a long time, they are due for an illness, leading them to worry unnecessarily. Others believe that because they've smoked for years without developing lung disease, they've somehow beaten the odds. But probability doesn't work like that. Past good luck doesn't make future bad luck more likely, just as past bad luck doesn't guarantee that good luck is coming. There's another side to this fallacy. Sometimes, people believe that past streaks must continue indefinitely. This is called the hot hand fallacy, and it's often seen in sports. A basketball player makes several shots in a row, and suddenly the crowd believes they're on fire, as if their past success makes them more likely to make the next shot. But just like the coin flip, each shot is an independent event. Their skill level and external factors affect the result, but the previous shots don't magically influence the next one. Humans are wired to seek patterns, even where none exist. Our brains evolved to find order in chaos, because recognizing patterns helped our ancestors survive. If berries grew in one part of the forest last season, they were likely to grow there again. If a predator was seen hunting near the river, it was smart to avoid that area. But in a world of pure randomness, our instincts betray us. We see patterns where there are none. We believe that probability has a memory, that the universe is balancing itself out, when in reality chance is just chance. The key to avoiding the gambler's fallacy is to remember that independent events remain independent. Just because something has happened multiple times, doesn't mean the opposite is coming next. And just because you've had bad luck doesn't mean good luck is on its way. So the next time you're in a casino, staring at a roulette wheel, watching a stock market chart, or making a big life decision, ask yourself, are you trusting logic, or are you falling for the illusion of patterns that don't exist? Goodhart's law. Have you ever noticed that sometimes, the more we try to measure something, the less meaningful that measurement becomes? Have you ever seen schools focusing so much on test scores that actual learning gets ignored? Or workplaces obsessed with performance metrics that employees start gaming the system instead of doing real work? This is Goodhart's law, a paradox that reveals a deep flaw in how we measure success. It states that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. In other words, the moment we turn a metric into a goal, people start focusing on manipulating the numbers rather than actually improving what the numbers were supposed to measure. Imagine a company that wants to increase productivity, so they decide to measure how many tasks employees complete each day. At first, this seems like a great idea. If employees finish more tasks, productivity must be increasing, right? But instead of working harder, employees start rushing through tasks, cutting corners, and breaking big tasks into smaller ones just to boost their numbers. The metric goes up, but actual productivity, it might even get worse. This paradox happens in education all the time. Schools are judged by standardized test scores, so teachers and administrators do whatever they can to increase those scores. But instead of truly improving education, they teach to the test, focusing only on the material that will be on the exam while ignoring everything else. The result? Students who might score well on tests but lack deeper knowledge, creativity, and critical thinking skills. The same thing happens in healthcare. Hospitals are often ranked by patient survival rates. So to keep their numbers looking good, some hospitals avoid treating high-risk patients, because if they die, it would lower the hospital's survival statistics. This means some of the sickest people, who need care the most, are turned away or sent elsewhere just so hospitals can maintain high rankings. This paradox has shaped history in some shocking ways. One of the most famous examples happened in colonial India. The British government, trying to reduce deadly cobra populations in Delhi, offered a bounty for every dead cobra. At first, people brought in dead cobras, and it seemed like the plan was working. But soon people realized they could make money by breeding cobras just to kill them and collect the reward. When the government discovered this and stopped the bounty, the cobra breeders released all their snakes back into the wild, making the problem even worse than before. A similar thing happened in Vietnam when the French government wanted to get rid of rats in Hanoi. They paid people for each rat tail turned in. But instead of killing the rats, some people cut off the tails and released the rats to breed more, ensuring a constant supply of tails for future rewards. Once again, the attempt to solve the problem only made it worse. This paradox is everywhere in modern business. Companies often use sales targets, quotas, and performance metrics to drive success. But employees quickly learn to game the system. Call center workers might hang up on difficult customers just to keep their average call time low. Car salespeople might push unnecessary add-ons to hit their monthly targets. Instead of improving business, the focus on metrics warps behavior in ways that actually harm the company in the long run. It also appears in social media. Platforms like YouTube and TikTok once aimed to provide entertaining and valuable content. But as soon as success became tied to metrics like views, likes, and engagement, content creators began optimizing for the algorithm instead of focusing on quality. The result? Clickbait, exaggerated headlines, and content designed not to inform or entertain but simply to keep you scrolling. Even scientific research isn't immune to Goodhart's law. In academia, researchers are often judged by how many papers they publish. But instead of focusing on groundbreaking discoveries, many researchers split their studies into multiple smaller papers just to increase their publication count, a practice known as salami slicing. This leads to more research papers overall, but not necessarily better science. The biggest problem with Goodhart's law is that it creates an illusion of success. When numbers go up, it looks like progress is being made. But in reality, people are just finding ways to manipulate the numbers instead of improving the actual system. So why do we fall for this trap? The reason is simple. We love measurable progress. Numbers give us a sense of control, a way to track improvement. But once a number becomes the goal, people start chasing the number rather than what it represents. So how do we escape this paradox? The key is to focus on the bigger picture, rather than just the numbers. Before setting targets, ask, is this metric actually measuring what we want to improve? Could people game the system instead of improving the real outcome? Are we focusing on short-term results instead of long-term success? Sometimes the best way to measure success isn't with numbers at all. Instead of focusing only on test scores, schools should ask, are students really learning? Instead of just tracking hospital survival rates, healthcare systems should ask, are we providing the best care for patients regardless of the risk? Instead of just counting sales, businesses should ask, are we creating real value for customers? Goodhart's law teaches us that numbers don't always tell the whole story. The next time you see a system where metrics seem more important than actual results, ask yourself, is this really measuring success, or has the metric itself become the goal? The grandfather paradox. Imagine you've just invented a time machine. The possibilities are endless. You can go back in time, witness historical events, change the past, but then an idea crosses your mind. What if you travel back and prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother? If you do that, your parent is never born, which means you are never born. But if you were never born, then you could have never traveled back in time to prevent their meeting in the first place. This is the grandfather paradox, one of the most famous and unsettling paradoxes in the realm of time travel. It exposes a deep contradiction in our understanding of cause and effect. If time travel to the past were possible, then certain actions like preventing your own birth would create an impossible situation. The paradox works like this. Suppose you travel back to the past and interfere with an event that led to your existence. Maybe you stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, or perhaps you do something more indirect, like preventing an ancestor from being in the right place at the right time. Either way, if you succeed, your own birth is erased from history. And if you were never born, then how did you go back in time in the first place? The paradox traps itself in a loop, one that seems to defy logic. This paradox suggests that time travel to the past might be fundamentally impossible, at least in the way we imagine it. If the past is changeable, then events could be rewritten in a way that makes their own causes impossible, an outcome that logic simply does not allow. But what if time travel is possible? How could the universe resolve this paradox? One potential solution is the Novikov self-consistency principle, a theory proposed by physicist Igor Novikov. This idea suggests that time travel might be allowed, but only in a way that prevents paradoxes. In other words, even if you go back in time, you would be unable to change events in a way that leads to a contradiction. Perhaps every attempt you make to stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother fails for some reason. Maybe you trip at the crucial moment, or circumstances align to ensure history stays on track. The timeline protects itself. Another possibility is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. This theory suggests that if you travel back in time and change the past, you don't alter your own timeline. You create a new parallel universe where history unfolds differently. In this version, you can prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, but all that means is that in this new timeline, you were never born. Meanwhile, in your original timeline, nothing changes. You simply jump to a different branch of reality. Then there's the idea that the past is already set in stone. Even if you could travel back in time, you were always meant to go back. Your actions were already part of history. If you try to stop your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, maybe your interference is actually what causes them to meet in the first place. The grandfather paradox raises one of the biggest questions about time. Is it fixed or is it fluid? If time travel were possible, would the universe find a way to prevent paradoxes, or would new realities splinter off every time the past is changed? And if you really could go back and change history, what would stop you from erasing the very moment that led you to time travel in the first place? The paradox of happiness. Have you ever noticed that the harder you try to achieve happiness, the more elusive it becomes? That the more you chase it, the further it seems to slip away? Have you ever set a goal, thinking it would finally make you happy, only to achieve it and feel exactly the same? This is the paradox of happiness, a strange and frustrating truth about human psychology. It reveals that the more we actively pursue happiness, the less likely we are to find it. Instead of making us happier, chasing happiness often leads to disappointment, anxiety, and even a sense of emptiness. At first, this seems counterintuitive. We are constantly told that happiness is something we should strive for, that if we just get the right job, make enough money, find the perfect relationship, or reach a certain milestone, we'll finally feel fulfilled. But research shows that when happiness becomes a goal in itself, it often backfires. One of the main reasons for this paradox is something called the hedonic treadmill. This is the idea that no matter what happens to us, good or bad, we always return to a baseline level of happiness. You might think winning the lottery would make you happy forever, or that a major failure would ruin your happiness permanently. But studies show that even after huge life events, people eventually return to their usual emotional state. A classic study looked at two groups of people, lottery winners and paralyzed accident victims. You'd expect the lottery winners to be much happier than the accident victims. But after a year, both groups had returned to roughly the same level of happiness they had before. The thrill of winning millions faded, just as the shock of losing mobility was gradually adapted to. This shows that external events don't have as much long-term impact on our happiness as we assume. The paradox gets worse when people make happiness their primary goal. Studies show that the more people focus on being happy, the more likely they are to feel lonely, anxious, or dissatisfied. When we constantly analyze whether we are happy enough, we set ourselves up for disappointment, because happiness isn't something we can measure or force. This effect is especially noticeable in modern society, where social media creates an endless comparison trap. People post curated versions of their lives, perfect vacations, exciting experiences, flawless relationships, and this creates an illusion that everyone else is happier than we are. The more we compare, the more we feel like we're missing out. Instead of making us happier, the constant pursuit of happiness makes us feel like we're failing at it. The paradox of happiness is also why many people feel empty after achieving a major goal. Athletes who train for years to win a championship often feel lost after their victory. Entrepreneurs who spend decades building a company sometimes feel strangely unfulfilled after they succeed. The same happens in everyday life. People think that getting a promotion, getting married, or buying a house will bring lasting happiness. But once the excitement wears off, they realize they feel pretty much the same. So if chasing happiness doesn't work, what does? The answer lies in a shift in focus. Instead of pursuing happiness directly, focus on things that naturally create happiness as a byproduct. One of the most reliable ways to feel happier isn't to chase pleasure or success, but to engage in meaningful activities. Studies show that people who focus on meaning rather than happiness, helping others, building strong relationships, engaging in fulfilling work, end up feeling happier in the long run. This is why people who do volunteer work often report higher levels of happiness than those who chase material success. Helping others shifts the focus away from ourselves, and ironically, that makes us feel better. The same goes for deep relationships. Instead of obsessing over happiness, people who invest in genuine connections with others experience more lasting fulfillment. Another key to overcoming the paradox of happiness is being present. Many people are unhappy because they are always living in the future, thinking, "I'll be happy when I get that job, when I lose weight, when I move to a new city." But happiness isn't something waiting for us in the future, it's something we experience right now, in the small moments of life. This is why mindfulness and gratitude have been found to be such powerful tools for happiness. People who take time to appreciate what they already have, rather than always striving for something more, tend to feel more content. Studies show that simply writing down 3 things you're grateful for each day can significantly improve well-being. The paradox also explains why pleasure-seeking behaviors often lead to less happiness, not more. Many people chase happiness through temporary highs, buying expensive things, indulging in food or alcohol, seeking constant entertainment. But the more we depend on external pleasures, the less satisfying they become over time. The thrill of a new purchase wears off, the excitement of a vacation fades, and then we're left needing another hit of happiness, just to feel normal again. This is why some of the happiest people aren't the ones who have the most pleasure, but the ones who have the most purpose. The most fulfilled people are often those who are working towards something meaningful, not obsessing over their own happiness, but finding joy in the process of creating, helping, and connecting. So how do we escape the paradox of happiness? The key is to stop chasing happiness as a goal, and instead create a life filled with meaning, connection, and presence. Before making a decision, ask yourself, am I doing this because it truly matters to me, or because I think it will make me happy? Am I focusing too much on what I don't have, instead of appreciating what I already do? Am I living in the present, or always waiting for future happiness? Am I engaging in deep, meaningful experiences, or just chasing short-term pleasure? The truth is, happiness isn't something you achieve, it's something you experience in the moments between chasing it. The harder you try to hold on to it, the more it slips away. But when you focus on living fully, loving deeply, and contributing to something bigger than yourself, happiness finds you. So the next time you catch yourself thinking, "I'll be happy when," pause. Ask yourself, what if I could just be happy now? Because sometimes the key to finding happiness is to stop looking for it. The paradox of intervention. Have you ever tried to fix a problem, only to realize later that your solution actually made things worse? Have you ever seen a well-intentioned plan backfire in ways no one expected? This is the paradox of intervention, a strange and frustrating truth about how our attempts to help solve problems or make things easier can sometimes create bigger problems in the long run. It happens when interventions, whether from governments, businesses, or individuals, introduce unintended consequences that ultimately harm the very thing they were meant to improve. At first, the logic behind intervention seems simple: if something is going wrong, fix it. But many systems, whether social, economic, medical, or environmental, are complex. They don't respond predictably to outside influence. A change in one part of the system can trigger unexpected ripple effects, creating new issues that are sometimes worse than the original problem. Imagine a government trying to save struggling businesses by giving them financial aid. On the surface, this seems like a great idea: help companies survive, keep people employed, and stabilize the economy. But over time, this intervention can lead to something called moral hazard, where businesses become dependent on government help instead of learning to adapt. Instead of creating a stronger economy, the intervention weakens it, as companies no longer feel the pressure to innovate or make responsible financial decisions. The same paradox exists in medicine. Antibiotics were one of the greatest medical discoveries in history, saving millions of lives. But their overuse has led to antibiotic-resistant bacteria, superbugs, that are harder to kill and more dangerous than the original infections. What started as a life-saving intervention has now created a new problem that threatens global health. Education is another area where intervention can backfire. Schools that focus too much on standardized testing in an effort to improve education often end up harming students instead. When test scores become the primary goal, teachers start teaching to the test rather than focusing on real learning. The result? Students might score well on exams, but lack critical thinking skills and real-world knowledge. Instead of creating better educated students, The system produces graduates who can memorize facts but struggle to apply them in real life. Even in nature, the paradox of intervention appears. Consider forest fires. For years, governments aggressively put out every wildfire to protect the environment and human settlements. But this well-intended intervention disrupted the natural cycle of forests, preventing smaller fires from clearing out dry brush. Over time, this led to bigger, more uncontrollable fires, as fuel built up in the forests. By trying to stop all fires, we accidentally made the ones that do happen much worse. The paradox also affects economics. Think about safety nets like unemployment benefits. These programs are designed to help people during tough times, and they absolutely do, but if they're too generous or last too long, they can create a disincentive to find work. Some people might choose to rely on assistance rather than searching for a job, leading to higher long-term unemployment. This same paradox exists in wildlife conservation. In some regions, when laws are put in place to ban hunting of endangered species, it can sometimes have the opposite effect. Local communities that once had an incentive to protect these animals, because responsible hunting provided income, may now see them as a burden. Without any economic benefit, some communities stop protecting the animals altogether, leading to increased poaching and habitat destruction. Even in personal relationships, intervention can create problems. Have you ever tried to help someone who was struggling, only to find that they became dependent on you instead of learning to solve their own problems? Parents who overprotect their children might believe they're keeping them safe, but in reality, they could be preventing them from developing resilience, problem-solving skills, and independence. The child grows up unable to handle real-world challenges because they were never given the chance to struggle and learn on their own. This paradox even affects mental health. Imagine someone dealing with anxiety. They might start avoiding situations that make them nervous, thinking this will help. But in reality, avoiding fears only makes them worse over time. The more they avoid stressful situations, the more anxiety controls their life. What started as a way to feel safe turns into a cycle that reinforces the fear instead of fixing it. So why does this happen? The reason is complex systems. Many of the things we try to fix, whether it's an economy, an ecosystem, or human behavior, are not simple problems with simple solutions. They are interconnected, and changing one part of the system often creates ripple effects that we didn't anticipate. Governments, companies, and individuals often focus on short-term fixes without considering the long-term consequences. A policy, a law, or a new system might seem like a great idea at first, but if it's not tested properly, it could lead to bigger issues down the line. This is why quick fixes often fail. If we don't consider the long-term effects of an intervention, we might end up solving one problem while creating an even bigger one. So how do we avoid the paradox of intervention? The key is thinking beyond short-term fixes and considering the long-term consequences of our actions. Before making changes, ask, could this create unintended side effects? Is this intervention treating the symptom or the root cause? Are we making people, businesses, or systems dependent on help instead of stronger on their own? Are we respecting natural balances, or are we forcing unnatural control? This is why some of the most effective solutions don't involve controlling a system but adapting to it. In medicine, instead of just creating stronger antibiotics, researchers are working on new approaches, like using bacteria's own weaknesses against them. In economics, policies that encourage education and skill building are often more effective than direct financial aid. In mental health, therapy that gradually exposes people to their fears works better than avoiding those fears entirely. Sometimes, the best intervention is no intervention at all. Instead of trying to control everything, we need to understand how systems naturally balance themselves and support that process rather than disrupting it. Because in the end, the road to disaster is often paved with good intentions, and sometimes, the best way to help is to step back and let things find their own way to balance. The knowledge paradox. Have you ever wondered why, even when people have access to all the information they need to make the right decision, they still make the wrong one? Have you ever seen someone ignore clear evidence, dismiss logical arguments, or refuse to change their mind, even when the truth is right in front of them? This is the knowledge paradox, a strange and frustrating reality where having more information doesn't always lead to better decisions. In fact, in some cases, the more we know, the more stubborn we become in our beliefs. Knowledge is supposed to help us see the world more clearly, but instead, it sometimes blinds us to reality. The smarter we become, the better we get at justifying our own mistakes. At first, this might seem impossible. Isn't knowledge supposed to make us smarter and more rational? Isn't learning more supposed to help us make better choices? The problem is, knowledge doesn't always lead to understanding, and it doesn't always make people more open to new ideas. Instead, it can sometimes make people more confident in their existing beliefs, even when they are wrong. One of the most well-documented examples of this paradox is the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is when people with little knowledge on a subject believe they know a lot, while true experts often doubt themselves. The reason is that people with limited knowledge don't know enough to see their own mistakes. Meanwhile, real experts understand how complex things actually are, which makes them more cautious in their conclusions. Ironically, the people who know the least feel the most certain, while the people who know the most question themselves the most. Another example of the knowledge paradox is confirmation bias. When people learn new information, they don't always process it neutrally. Instead, they tend to accept facts that confirm what they already believe and ignore facts that challenge their opinions. This is why political debates rarely change anyone's mind. People don't seek the truth, they seek validation for what they already believe. This paradox is also visible in conspiracy theories. Many conspiracy theorists are highly knowledgeable, but instead of using their knowledge to uncover truth, they use it to find patterns that reinforce their beliefs. The more they research, the more they convince themselves that they're right, even when the evidence says otherwise. This is why arguing with a conspiracy theorist can feel impossible. Every fact you present just strengthens their belief, because they see it as part of a larger hidden agenda. The same effect can be seen in scientific and medical misinformation. Someone who reads a handful of articles online about health might think they know more than doctors who have spent decades studying medicine. Instead of trusting experts, they assume they have figured out something the professionals missed, even when their understanding is completely flawed. This is why many people today believe in pseudoscience, because they feel like they've done their own research, even if they don't have the training to interpret that research correctly. The knowledge paradox also affects decision-making in business, government, and everyday life. Have you ever seen a company ignore warnings about a risky investment because they were too confident in their research? Or a leader who dismissed expert advice because they believed they knew better? History is filled with examples of disasters caused by overconfidence in knowledge, from failed military strategies to economic crashes. One of the most famous examples is the 2008 financial crisis. Many of the top financial experts in the world believed they had created a foolproof system, but their overconfidence blinded them to the risks. They had all the information they needed to prevent the crisis, but they ignored the warnings. Their knowledge didn't protect them, it made them more reckless. The crisis happened not because people didn't understand finance, but because they believed they understood it too well. So why does this happen? The reason is that knowledge doesn't just increase what we know, it also increases our confidence. But confidence and accuracy aren't the same thing. When people gain knowledge, they often stop questioning themselves. They assume they are right and become less willing to listen to others. This is why intelligence doesn't always prevent mistakes. In fact, smart people can be even more vulnerable to the knowledge paradox because they are better at defending their own false beliefs. The smarter someone is, the better they are at finding arguments to justify their opinions, even when they're wrong. This paradox has shaped history in ways that most people don't realize. Galileo was condemned for his scientific discoveries not by ignorant people, but by some of the most educated minds of his time. Many of history's greatest mistakes were made by leaders, scholars, and intellectuals, not because they lacked knowledge, but because they believed in their own knowledge too much. Even today, the knowledge paradox is everywhere. Have you ever seen tech companies release updates that make things worse? Or scientific studies that contradict each other every few years? Or laws that try to solve one problem but accidentally create new ones? Sometimes, more knowledge leads to overthinking, overconfidence, and unintended consequences. So how do we escape the knowledge paradox? Key is intellectual humility, the ability to recognize that no matter how much we know, we could still be wrong. Instead of using knowledge to prove ourselves right, we should use it to challenge our own beliefs. One way to do this is by asking ourselves, am I truly open to being wrong, or am I just looking for evidence that supports my beliefs? Do I listen to opposing views with an open mind, or do I immediately dismiss them? Am I confusing confidence with certainty? When was the last time I admitted I was wrong about something important? True wisdom doesn't come from just knowing more, it comes from understanding the limits of our own knowledge. The greatest minds in history weren't the ones who claimed to have all the answers, but the ones who kept asking better questions. This is why some of the smartest people in history were also the most humble. Socrates, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, famously said, "I know that I know nothing." He understood that the pursuit of truth isn't about gathering knowledge, it's about recognizing how much we still don't know. The knowledge paradox teaches us an important lesson. The more we learn, the more we must be willing to question ourselves. The moment we believe we have all the answers, we stop learning. The moment we stop listening to others, we close ourselves off from new discoveries. So the next time you feel certain about something, take a step back. Ask yourself, could I be wrong? Could there be more to this than I realize? Because sometimes, the biggest obstacle to truth is thinking we already have it. The liar paradox. Imagine encountering a simple sentence. This statement is false. At first glance, it seems straightforward, but as you ponder it, a perplexing dilemma emerges. If the statement is true, then it must be false, as it asserts. However, if it's false, then it must be true, since it claims to be false. This creates a paradox, where the statement cannot be consistently classified as either true or false. This conundrum is known as the liar paradox, a self-referential puzzle that has intrigued philosophers and logicians for centuries. Its origins trace back to ancient Greece, where the philosopher Eubulides of Miletus posed the question, a man says that he is lying, is what he says true or false? This formulation presents the same dilemma. If the man is lying, he's telling the truth about lying, which means he's not lying, a contradiction. Another historical reference is the Epimenides paradox. Epimenides, a Cretan philosopher, reportedly stated, all Cretans are liars. Since Epimenides himself was a Cretan, his statement implies that he is lying, leading to a paradox, if we assume his statement is true. The liar paradox challenges our foundational understanding of truth and has profound implications in philosophy, logic, and mathematics. It has spurred extensive debate and analysis over the centuries. One significant development, influenced by this paradox, is Alfred Tarski's work on the concept of truth. Tarski concluded that a language cannot consistently contain a complete truth predicate for its own sentences. In other words, to avoid paradoxes like the liar, a distinction must be made between the language used to discuss objects, the object language, and the language used to discuss sentences in the object language, the meta-language. This hierarchical approach prevents self-referential statements that lead to contradictions. In mathematics, the liar paradox is closely related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Kurt Gödel demonstrated that in any sufficiently powerful formal system, there are statements that are true but cannot be proven within the system. He constructed a statement that essentially asserts its own unprovability, echoing the self-referential nature of the liar paradox. This groundbreaking work revealed inherent limitations in formal systems and has had lasting impacts on mathematical logic and philosophy. Various approaches have been proposed to resolve or circumvent the liar paradox. Paraconsistent logics. These non-classical logics allow for contradictions to exist without collapsing into complete incoherence. In such systems, a statement can be both true and false simultaneously, accommodating the paradox without inconsistency. Fuzzy logic. This approach permits truth values to range between entirely true and entirely false. Applying fuzzy logic to the liar paradox, the statement, "This sentence is false," could be assigned an intermediate truth value, reflecting its ambiguous nature. Contextual solutions. Some philosophers suggest that the paradox arises due to a confusion of language levels or contexts. By clearly distinguishing between different levels of discourse, the self-referential loop can be avoided. The liar paradox also invites exploration into the nature of self-reference and its potential pitfalls. The self-referential statements are those that refer to themselves, either directly or indirectly. While not all self-referential statements are paradoxical, the liar paradox exemplifies how self-reference can lead to contradictions. This has implications for various fields, including computer science, where self-referential structures must be carefully managed to prevent logical inconsistencies. As you reflect on this paradox, consider how it challenges our conventional understanding of truth and prompts deeper inquiry into the complexities of language, logic, and self-reference. Simpson's paradox. Why do numbers sometimes lie? Why do statistics, which are supposed to give us clear and objective truths, sometimes lead us to completely misleading conclusions? There's a strange and unsettling mathematical illusion known as Simpson's paradox. A paradox that shows how trends that appear in individual groups can completely reverse when those groups are combined. It's not a mistake in calculation, and it's not an illusion in our minds. It's a flaw in the way we interpret numbers, and it can mislead us in everything from medicine to education, from business to politics, and even in how we compare ourselves to others. To understand how Simpson's paradox works, imagine two students, Alex and Jordan, who are applying to college. Each of them applies to two different universities, one that is very competitive and one that is less selective. When we look at their individual acceptance rates, we see that at the competitive university, Alex has a higher acceptance rate than Jordan. At the less selective university, Alex again has a higher acceptance rate than Jordan. It seems obvious that Alex must be the better applicant overall, but when we combine the numbers from both universities, something strange happens. Jordan now has a higher total acceptance rate than Alex. How can this be? The trick is in how many times each person applied to each school. If Alex applied mostly to the more competitive university, where acceptance rates are lower, then their overall percentage is pulled down. Meanwhile, if Jordan applied more often to the less competitive university, their overall success rate is inflated. This is Simpson's paradox in action. A pattern that is true in each group disappears or even reverses when the groups are combined. It sounds like a minor mathematical curiosity, but in reality, this paradox has had profound effects on real-world decisions. One of the most famous examples comes from a 1973 lawsuit against the University of California, Berkeley. The university was accused of gender discrimination in graduate admissions. The overall data showed that a smaller percentage of women were accepted compared to men, suggesting that the university was biased against female applicants. But when researchers broke the data down by individual departments, something unexpected emerged. Most departments actually accepted women at a higher rate than men. So what was happening? The answer was simple: women were applying to more competitive programs with lower acceptance rates, while men were applying to departments where admission was easier. The numbers weren't lying, but they were misleading. The overall trend suggested discrimination when in reality, the pattern was caused by different application choices. The same paradox can even influence medical research. Imagine two treatments for a disease, treatment A and treatment B. For men, treatment A appears to work better than treatment B. For women, treatment A again seems better than treatment B. But when we combine the data for both men and women, suddenly treatment B looks like the better option overall. How is this possible? If one treatment was mostly given to people with more severe cases, while the other was used for milder cases, then the numbers become misleading. A treatment might appear worse simply because it was being used for the most difficult cases, not because it was actually ineffective. Misinterpreting data like this can lead to flawed medical decisions, potentially putting lives at risk. Simpson's paradox also shows up in crime statistics, racial disparities, business trends, and political elections. Imagine a politician claiming that nationwide crime rates have dropped, while in every individual city, crime has actually gone up. How can both be true? It happens if crime is increasing in small, densely populated areas, but decreasing in larger, less populated regions. When combined, the numbers create the illusion that overall crime is going down, even when the reality is that most people are experiencing the opposite. Or consider wage statistics. A company might proudly announce that average employee wages are rising overall. But when we look closer, we find that in every department, wages are actually going down. How is this possible? If the company hires more workers in high-paying roles, the overall average will go up, even if individual employees are actually earning less than before. Again, the numbers aren't lying, but they are hiding the full truth. But perhaps the most unsettling way Simpson's paradox affects us isn't in statistics, it's in how we perceive our own lives. You might look at different aspects of your life, your career, your relationships, your personal achievements, and see that you're doing well in each one. But when you combine everything together, it suddenly feels like you're falling behind. Why? Because just like in statistics, you're looking at the wrong picture. You're comparing your overall progress to others' individual successes, creating an illusion that everyone else is ahead while you're stuck in place. Simpson's paradox proves that numbers don't always tell the full story. It shows that even when the math is correct, the way we interpret it can be completely wrong. So the next time someone presents a statistic that seems to prove something obvious, stop and ask, is this the full picture? Or is the paradox tricking me? The Theseus Paradox. Imagine you're standing in front of a massive pile of sand. You reach down, pick up a single grain, and let it slip through your fingers. That one grain isn't a heap of sand, it's just a single grain. But what if you pick up 2 grains? Still not a heap. 3, 10, 100? At what exact point does a collection of grains become a heap? This is the Theseus Paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, and it reveals something unsettling about the way we define vague concepts. We intuitively understand what a heap is, yet we can't pinpoint the exact boundary between not a heap and a heap. But here's where it gets even more interesting. What happens if we reverse the process? Imagine you start with a large, undeniable heap of sand. You remove a single grain. It's still a heap, right? Remove another grain. Still a heap. But what about after removing 100 grains? 1,000? At what exact point does it stop being a heap? It seems absurd to say that removing a single grain suddenly transforms a heap into not a heap. And yet, if you follow this process to the end, you eventually arrive at a single grain of sand, and that clearly isn't a heap. So where did the heap go? This paradox highlights a fundamental problem in the way we use language. We rely on words that have fuzzy boundaries, but reality doesn't always give us clear-cut definitions. It's not just about sand. This problem appears everywhere in life. Take the concept of baldness. If a person has a full head of hair and loses a single strand, they are obviously not bald. But if they keep losing one hair at a time, at what exact moment do they cross over from not bald to bald? There's no obvious dividing line. But if we can't identify one, then does baldness even have a real meaning? Think about age. When does a person stop being young and start being old? Is it at 30, 40, 60? No one can say for sure. But if there's no precise moment where youth ends and old age begins, then what does it actually mean to be old? And it doesn't stop there. Laws, morality, and even personal identity all suffer from this same problem. Imagine a city gradually changing over time. New buildings replace old ones. Streets are rerouted. Entire neighborhoods are transformed. At what point does the city stop being the same city? Or think about a person. Over the years, your cells regenerate. Your thoughts change, your personality evolves. You are not exactly the same person you were 5 years ago, so at what point do you stop being you? This is the deep and unsettling nature of the Theseus Paradox. It forces us to question whether many of the words we rely on even have real, objective meaning. Philosophers have struggled with this problem for centuries, and several solutions have been proposed. One approach is called fuzzy logic. In traditional logic, things are either true or false. But fuzzy logic allows for degrees of truth. Instead of saying, this is a heap, or this is not a heap, we might say, this is mostly a heap, or this is somewhat a heap. It allows for gradual transitions, rather than strict categories. This can be useful, but it still doesn't solve the problem completely. It just makes it more manageable. Another idea is the supervaluationist approach, which suggests that vague terms like heap don't have precise boundaries, and that's okay. We can use context and practical reasoning to decide how to apply them in a given situation, even if there is no single correct answer. Then there's the epistemic theory, which argues that there is a precise cutoff point between a heap and a non-heap. We just don't know what it is. According to this view, there's some exact number of grains that make a heap. We just don't have the ability to determine it. But this raises another problem. If no one can ever know the exact boundary, does it even exist? The Theseus Paradox isn't just an abstract thought experiment. It has real consequences. Think about the legal system. Laws often depend on vague definitions. What counts as reasonable force in self-defense? What counts as obscenity? How much evidence is needed before someone is considered guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? These are all fuzzy concepts, and yet real lives depend on how they are interpreted. And then there's the most unsettling question of all. If you take away 1 second of your life, you're still you. But if you take away another, and another, at what point do you stop being you? The Condorcet Paradox reveals a deep flaw in the way we categorize the world. If so many of the things we take for granted have no clear boundaries, then what does that say about reality itself? Are we just drawing imaginary lines, pretending that the world is more defined than it really is? And if we can't even say when a heap of sand stops being a heap, how can we ever say with certainty who or what we really are? The sunk cost fallacy. Have you ever noticed that the longer you invest in something, the harder it becomes to walk away, even when you know you should? Whether it's waiting in a slow-moving line, watching a boring movie, staying in a failing business, or holding on to a toxic relationship, the more time, money, or effort you've put in, the more difficult it feels to quit. This is the sunk cost fallacy, a psychological trap that makes people stick with bad decisions simply because they've already invested in them. Even when logic says it's time to move on, something deep inside resists, whispering, "But I've already spent so much time on this, I can't just quit now." To understand this, imagine you've bought an expensive ticket to a concert. When the day arrives, it's raining, you're exhausted, and you don't even like the band as much as you thought you would. Logically, the best decision is to skip the concert and do something you'd actually enjoy. But instead, you feel obligated to go, because you already paid for the ticket. Even though the money is already gone, you feel like you'd be wasting it if you don't go. The truth is, the money is a sunk cost. It's already spent, and you can't get it back. The logical choice is to base your decision on the present. Would you still choose to go if the ticket were free? If the answer is no, then the smart choice is to walk away. The sunk cost fallacy happens in all areas of life, from business to relationships, from education to everyday decisions. Think about a company that has spent millions of dollars on a failing project. Even when it becomes clear that the project won't succeed, they keep throwing more money into it just because they've already spent so much. Governments do the same thing, funding failed programs for years instead of cutting their losses. No one wants to admit that their past efforts were wasted, so they keep investing more and more, making the problem even worse. The same thing happens in careers and education. Someone who has spent years studying for a degree they don't enjoy might feel trapped in a job they hate, simply because they've already spent so much time working toward it. They think, "I can't switch careers now, I've already spent 5 years in this field." But the real question is, do I want to spend the next 20 years doing something I don't enjoy? Relationships fall into the same trap. People stay in unhappy relationships, not because they're happy, but because they've already been together for years. They think, "I've already invested so much time, I can't just throw it all away." But staying in a bad relationship doesn't undo the wasted time, it just wastes even more. The sunk cost fallacy can even influence small everyday decisions. Imagine watching a terrible movie. Halfway through, you realize it's awful. You could turn it off and watch something better, but instead, you keep watching thinking, "I've already watched an hour, I might as well finish." But that hour is gone. The smart choice is to cut your losses and do something better with your time. Now imagine this on a larger scale, like war. Throughout history, governments have continued wars long after they should have ended, simply because they had already sacrificed too much to stop. Leaders justify further destruction by saying, "We can't let those lives be lost in vain," even when continuing the war only leads to more losses. The sunk costs of war, both human and financial, keep countries trapped in conflicts that could have ended much sooner. So why do we fall into this trap? The reason is loss aversion. Our brains are wired to hate losing more than we enjoy gaining. When we realize we've wasted time, money, or effort, we don't want to admit the loss, so we double down, hoping to make the effort feel worth it. But in reality, continuing down the wrong path only wastes more. The fallacy is so powerful because it preys on our emotions. Walking away can feel like failure, admitting a mistake can be painful. We want to believe that our investments, whether financial, emotional, or time-based, were worth it. But the truth is, that past effort doesn't justify future suffering. So how do we break free? The key is to focus on the present and the future, not the past. When making a decision, ask yourself, if I were starting fresh, would I still make this choice? Am I continuing this just because I don't want to admit past mistakes? Would I be happier if I walked away? Because in the end, what's gone is gone, and the best way to move forward is to stop letting the past control your future. The paradox of thrift. Why does it feel like the more you save, the less money you seem to have? Why do efforts to be financially responsible sometimes seem to make things worse instead of better? This strange economic contradiction is known as the paradox of thrift, an idea introduced by economist John Maynard Keynes. At first glance, it seems obvious that saving money is a good thing. After all, being financially responsible means setting aside money for the future, preparing for unexpected expenses, and ensuring long-term stability. But what happens when everyone starts saving at the same time? In personal finance, saving is a smart decision. If you cut back on unnecessary expenses, avoid debt, and put money away, you improve your own financial situation. But economies don't function like individuals. When too many people save at once, something strange happens. The economy slows down, businesses make less money, and in the end, people actually end up with less wealth than before. To understand how this works, imagine a small town where people suddenly decide to save more and spend less. Restaurants see fewer customers, stores sell fewer products, companies begin to struggle because businesses make less money. They cut back on wages, lay off workers, or even close down. Now, with fewer people earning an income, even less money is spent, creating a vicious cycle. This is the paradox of thrift. What is smart for one person can be disastrous when everyone does it at once. If individuals save more and cut spending, businesses lose revenue, leading to lower wages and higher unemployment. As a result, even though people are trying to protect their financial future, they actually make the economy weaker, reducing overall wealth. This paradox is most noticeable during economic recessions. When uncertainty rises, whether from a financial crisis, job instability, or global events, people naturally hold on to their money, spending only on essentials. This reaction makes sense on an individual level, but if millions of people do the same, the entire economy slows down. Businesses stop hiring, investments shrink, and the overall system begins to stall. Governments try to counter this effect by encouraging spending during recessions. They lower interest rates to make borrowing money easier, send out stimulus checks, or invest in large public projects to create jobs. These actions are designed to increase spending and keep the economy moving, even when people are too cautious to spend on their own. But the paradox creates a dilemma. Encouraging people to spend more can feel irresponsible, especially when saving is seen as the wiser, more disciplined choice. Yet history has shown that excessive saving during a crisis can make things worse. During the Great Depression, many people hoarded money out of fear, causing businesses to collapse and prolonging economic hardship. In contrast, during times of strong economic growth, consumer spending fuels expansion, allowing businesses to hire more workers and create better opportunities. So does this mean saving money is bad? Not at all. The paradox of thrift doesn't argue against saving. It simply warns that saving too much too quickly can slow down economic growth. A healthy economy relies on a balance. Individuals saving enough for security, while still spending enough to keep businesses running. The paradox also raises a bigger question about financial responsibility. We are often told to save money, reduce debt, and be cautious with spending. But what happens when those principles, followed too strictly, create the very conditions that make saving harder? If businesses fail, jobs disappear, and wages drop, the money people worked so hard to save may lose its value, trapped in a struggling economy with fewer opportunities. The lesson of the paradox of thrift is that economies work differently than individuals. What makes sense for one person can create instability for an entire system. The key isn't to avoid saving, but to recognize that saving too much, all at once, can have unintended consequences. So the next time you think about saving, ask yourself, is everyone else doing the same? And if so, could that be making things worse for everyone? The paradox of understanding. Have you ever noticed that sometimes, the more you try to understand something, the more confusing it becomes? That the deeper you dive into a topic, the more questions arise instead of answers? Have you ever tried to fully grasp an idea, only to realize how little you actually know? This is the paradox of understanding, a fascinating contradiction, where the more knowledge we acquire, the more aware we become of how much we don't know. Instead of feeling more certain, we often feel less sure, because every answer we find leads to more questions. At first, this seems strange. We assume that gaining knowledge should make things clearer, that learning more should make us more confident, more certain, more in control. But in reality, the deeper we explore any subject, whether it's science, philosophy, history, or even our own emotions, the more we realize that the world is infinitely complex. This paradox is captured perfectly by an old saying: the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And throughout history, some of the greatest minds, scientists, philosophers, and thinkers have all echoed this same idea. One of the most famous examples is Socrates, the Greek philosopher who famously declared, "I know that I know nothing." This wasn't false humility. It was a profound realization that true wisdom isn't about having all the answers, but about understanding the limits of one's knowledge. This paradox is also seen in science. Every time scientists discover something new, it opens more questions than it answers. For example, for centuries, people thought atoms were the smallest building blocks of the universe. Then we discovered subatomic particles, then quarks, then quantum fields. The deeper we look, the more mysterious reality becomes. Instead of reaching a final answer, every breakthrough reveals another layer of complexity. The same thing happens in cosmology. We once thought we understood the universe's structure. Then we discovered dark matter and dark energy, which make up 95% of the universe, but we have no idea what they actually are. In trying to understand the cosmos, we've only realized how little we truly comprehend. Even in medicine, the more we learn about the human body, the more we see how much remains unexplained. We now know that the gut microbiome, once thought to be insignificant, plays a critical role in mental health and immunity. We've mapped the human genome, but still don't fully understand how genes interact with the environment. Every answer leads to new, deeper mysteries. This paradox also applies to philosophy and human behavior. People spend their lives searching for the meaning of existence, the nature of consciousness, or the foundations of morality. But the more they explore these topics, the more complicated they become. What is free will? What is truth? What does it mean to be good? Instead of finding final answers, we find more perspectives, more interpretations, more questions. Even in personal growth, the more self-aware we become, the more we realize how complex our own minds are. We start by trying to understand our emotions, only to discover subconscious fears, past traumas, and hidden motivations. Instead of becoming more certain of who we are, deep self-exploration often leads to more uncertainty, more depth, more unanswered questions. So why does this happen? Why does gaining knowledge often make us feel less certain instead of more? One reason is that the universe and human existence is not a simple system. It's not like a math problem with one clear answer. It's an infinitely layered, interconnected reality where every question leads to more complexity. Another reason is that most of what we think we know is actually surface-level knowledge. When we begin learning something, we only see the basics, the broad strokes, the simplified explanations. It's easy to feel like we get it when we've only scratched the surface. But the deeper we go, the more we realize that what seemed simple is actually deeply intricate and uncertain. This is why beginners often feel more confident than experts. In psychology, this is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive bias, where people with limited knowledge believe they understand a subject far better than they actually do. But as people gain more knowledge, their confidence often drops, because they become aware of how much they still don't know. This paradox has major implications for society and decision-making. Many of the most dangerous ideas come from people who believe they have all the answers. History is full of leaders, politicians, and ideologues who were completely certain they were right, only to later realize how wrong they were. True wisdom doesn't come from knowing everything, but from understanding how little we actually know. This is why some of the most brilliant minds in history were also the most humble. They didn't see knowledge as something that gave them absolute certainty. They saw it as a journey with no final destination. So how do we deal with the paradox of understanding? The key is intellectual humility, the ability to embrace uncertainty, to stay open to new perspectives, and to never assume we've reached the final answer. Instead of fearing how much we don't know, we should see it as an invitation to keep learning. Before making conclusions, ask yourself, do I truly understand this, or have I just scratched the surface? Could there be deeper layers of complexity I haven't considered? Am I open to changing my mind if new evidence emerges? Am I mistaking confidence for true understanding? The most enlightened people aren't those who claim to know everything, but those who remain curious, humble, and always willing to learn. The paradox of understanding teaches us that there is no final answer, only deeper exploration. The universe is not something to be conquered intellectually, but something to be engaged with endlessly. So the next time you feel uncertain, overwhelmed, or lost in knowledge, remember that feeling isn't a sign of failure, it's a sign that you're truly thinking. Because the moment we believe we have all the answers is the moment we stop growing. The paradox of voting. Why does it feel like no matter how much effort you put into something, the final outcome barely changes? Why do small individual actions often seem powerless against the bigger picture? This unsettling reality is known as the paradox of voting, a contradiction that questions whether voting in elections or making any individual contribution to a large system actually matters. On one hand, we're told that every vote counts, that participating in elections is a fundamental part of democracy. But when you look at the math, the likelihood of your single vote changing the outcome of an election is almost zero. If millions of people are voting, your decision might seem completely insignificant. This creates a dilemma. If your vote doesn't actually change the result, then why vote at all? If thousands or even millions of other people are deciding the same thing, isn't the outcome already determined before you even show up? At first glance, the paradox makes perfect sense. In a national election, the odds of a single vote tipping the result are microscopic, so small that statistically speaking, your individual choice is irrelevant. Economists and political scientists often point out that the time and effort it takes to vote outweighs the personal benefit. After all, if your vote won't change anything, wouldn't your time be better spent doing something else? And yet, elections still happen. People still vote. Democracies still function. So why do people continue to participate in something that, logically, seems pointless? The answer lies in a different way of looking at the problem. While one vote alone is unlikely to change an election, voting is a collective action, not an individual one. A single drop of rain doesn't cause a flood, but millions of drops together create a storm. This paradox plays out in many areas of life, not just politics. Imagine a crowded freeway, full of people trying to get to work. If one driver chooses to take public transportation instead of driving, it won't reduce traffic in any noticeable way. But if thousands of people make the same decision, the difference is huge. Or consider environmental efforts. If you start recycling, it won't save the planet by itself. If you use less electricity, the power grid won't even notice. But if millions of people make small changes in their habits, the collective impact can be enormous. The paradox of voting teaches us that individual actions feel meaningless only if we assume we are acting alone. But in reality, every movement, every shift in society, is the result of many individuals making the same small decisions. There's also another factor. People don't just vote because they expect to change the result. Many people vote because they believe in the principle of participation, because it gives them a sense of civic responsibility. Others vote to express their opinions, even if they know their candidate won't win. For some, voting is a symbolic act, an emotional and ethical choice rather than a purely logical one. The paradox also raises a darker question. What happens if too many people stop believing their actions matter? If enough voters decide that their participation is meaningless, turnout drops, and elections can be decided by a small, highly motivated minority rather than the majority. A similar problem happens in economics. If too many people believe their taxes won't make a difference, fewer people pay, and the system collapses. If too many people believe their personal environmental choices are meaningless, no action is taken, and the problem gets worse. This paradox forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. The system only works if people believe in it. Participation only matters if enough people decide that it matters. The moment we stop believing our small contributions add up, the system itself begins to fail. So is your single vote truly meaningless, or is it just one piece of something much bigger, something that only works because enough people trust that their actions together create the future? The time-saving paradox. Have you ever felt like no matter how many time-saving tools you use, you still don't have enough time? Have you ever automated a task, only to find yourself filling the extra time with even more work. Have you ever thought that technology was supposed to make life easier, but instead, it just made everything feel faster, busier, and more overwhelming? This is the time-saving paradox, a strange contradiction, where the more efficiently we try to use our time, the less time we actually seem to have. Instead of creating more free time, increased efficiency often leads to increased expectations, making us feel busier than ever. At first, this seems counterintuitive. Technology has given us faster communication, automation, and productivity tools that should, in theory, free up more of our time. In the past, people had to send letters by mail. Now we can send emails instantly. We used to wash clothes by hand. Now we have machines that do it for us. We have smartphones, AI assistants, fast food, online shopping, and high-speed travel. Yet somehow, despite all these conveniences, people feel more rushed and overwhelmed than ever. One of the main reasons for this paradox is something called Parkinson's law, the idea that work expands to fill the time available. If you finish a task more quickly, instead of enjoying the extra free time, you just take on more tasks. If your job becomes more efficient, instead of working fewer hours, you're expected to get more done in the same amount of time. Efficiency doesn't reduce workload, it increases it. Think about email. In the past, sending a letter required effort. You had to write it, mail it, and wait for a response. This meant communication was slower, but it also meant people put more thought into what they wrote. Today, email is instant, but because it's so fast, we are expected to send and respond to far more messages. Instead of saving time, email has created a world where people are drowning in unread messages, notifications, and constant communication. The same paradox appears in work productivity. Computers, automation, and artificial intelligence should, in theory, reduce workloads. But instead, as work becomes more efficient, companies raise expectations, pushing employees to do more in less time. Instead of working less, people now work longer hours, and the boundary between work and personal life is thinner than ever. Remote work, once seen as a way to save commuting time, has often just led to endless emails, late-night meetings, and the expectation of always being available. The paradox is also visible in transportation. Faster travel should mean we can get places quicker and have more free time. But instead of enjoying this, we just travel more, commute longer distances, and expect to get more done. Highways were supposed to reduce traffic, but studies show that when roads get wider, more people start driving, and congestion remains the same or even gets worse. This phenomenon, called induced demand, shows that faster systems don't necessarily save time, they just lead to more usage, more congestion, and more stress. Even in leisure and entertainment, the time-saving paradox appears. Streaming services like Netflix and YouTube allow us to watch anything instantly, without waiting for TV schedules. But instead of watching less, we binge-watch entire seasons, spending more time consuming content than ever before. Social media gives us instant updates on friends and news, but instead of freeing up time, it traps people in endless scrolling, checking notifications, and feeling the need to stay constantly updated. The paradox also applies to exercise and health. In theory, modern fitness programs are designed to help people stay healthy in less time, with quick workouts, diet shortcuts, and supplements. But instead of feeling healthier, many people feel more pressure than ever to track every calorie, optimize every workout, and constantly chase an ideal body image. What was supposed to be a simple process, staying healthy, has turned into a complex, time-consuming system of tracking, measuring, and optimizing. So why does this happen? Why doesn't saving time actually save time? One reason is that humans are wired to fill available time with activity. We don't like empty space. When we finish tasks more quickly, we don't naturally use the extra time to relax. We find more things to do. Whether it's work, social media, hobbies, or errands, there's always something demanding our attention. Another reason is that modern society rewards busyness. Being busy is often seen as a sign of productivity, success, or importance. People feel guilty for not working, not responding quickly, or not using their time efficiently, even when doing nothing is exactly what they need. This paradox also exists because more efficiency creates higher expectations. In a world where everything is fast, people expect instant results, constant availability, and non-stop progress. If technology allows a business to process orders in minutes, Customers expect that everything should always be instant. If you can reply to an email from your phone in seconds, people expect you to always be available. Instead of saving time, efficiency raises the standard of what is considered normal, making everyone feel like they're falling behind. So how do we escape the time-saving paradox? The key is intentionally choosing how we use our time, instead of letting technology and expectations control us. Before adopting new tools, habits, or schedules, ask yourself, is this actually saving me time, or is it just making me do more? Am I filling my free time with unnecessary busyness? Do I feel pressure to always be productive, even when I don't need to be? Am I optimizing life so much that I forget to enjoy it? Some of the happiest and most successful people today aren't the ones who do the most, they're the ones who know when to stop. They set boundaries with work, limit distractions, and recognize that being constantly busy isn't the same as living well. This is why movements like slow living, minimalism, and digital detoxing are becoming more popular, because people are realizing that real freedom isn't about doing everything faster, but about doing fewer things with more intention. The time-saving paradox teaches us an important lesson. Efficiency doesn't always lead to a better life. Faster doesn't always mean happier. More productivity doesn't always mean more fulfillment. The real goal shouldn't be just to save time, but to use time in a way that actually brings joy, balance, and meaning. So the next time you catch yourself rushing, optimizing, or feeling overwhelmed by technology, ask yourself, am I actually saving time, or just making life busier? Because sometimes the best way to save time is to slow down and enjoy it.